listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states and the increasingly disunited, divided surface of our globe. In the Independent Corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together, that almost certainly means you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Although you never can be too sure. Good morning, folks. It's Friday, September 17th. It is 7:01 a.m. Eastern by my clock's measure. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, we got about 154,000, really 155,000 almost, new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There were also 3,415 deaths reported. That's higher than it had been. We were talking yesterday about how if you've taken the two, yesterday and the day before together, those deaths would have been over 5,000, which is about the peak we saw. Well, yesterday's numbers were even higher. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 150,000 cases per day. That's a decrease of 9% from the average 2 weeks earlier. That's a slight decrease. That's good. 54% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 63% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 41,790,700 people across the U.S. It has killed 670,231 people. Today, the FDA's Independent Advisory Committee will convene to debate the Pfizer booster shots. They will be discussing if the booster is safe enough for widespread use and whether it's necessary and effective at improving protection levels against COVID-19. The vote is non-binding, but the FDA generally follows the advice of the board. After Angela Underwood's husband went into the ICU for COVID-19, she demanded they use ivermectin to treat him. The staff refused, and Underwood has taken them to court. Underwood, being a registered nurse, believed it was a good option for emergency use in this case. The judge delivered a scathing resolution denying her claim and calling out people who have promoted and supported the deworming drug as an effective treatment for battling COVID-19. In national news, tomorrow Washington, D.C. will serve as the site for the Justice for January 6th, or the Justice for J6 rally, which will take place outside of the Capitol. The rally is intended to serve as a defense for those who are being charged in connection to the breach of the Capitol on January 6th. Fencing that had been installed following January 6th has been reinstalled in advance of tomorrow's rally. They're worried, of course, about another attempted breach. The word, however, is that far-right and right-wing groups have warned against attending the rally. A viral TikTok trend known as quote-unquote devious licks is hitting school districts all across the country. The trend has kids steal random things from their schools, then post the results to the app. What started as mouse pads and soap dispensers has turned into urinals, projectors, whiteboards, and even a school bus, all stolen by students. Schools have responded with strict punishments and various new policies like locking bathrooms during class times. TikTok has stated they will be banning videos that feature this challenge. That was a bridge too far for them, apparently. In international news, the French government has canceled a meeting with the United States following the passage of a defense deal with Australia, which cut France out of a lucrative $90 billion contract to sell Australia submarines. France's foreign minister had earlier called the move, quote, the deal of the century, end quote, and has since said this is a, quote unquote, stab in the back by the American government. The United States announced this deal on Wednesday, which will sell Australia nuclear-powered submarines in a partnership which includes the United Kingdom. South Africa's former president Jacob Zuma lost his bid to overturn his 15-month jail sentence for contempt of court after failing to appear at a corruption inquiry. He had argued that the sentence was excessive, saying it endangered his health. Zuma is 79 years old. In Russia, allies of Alexei Navalny are responding negatively to a decision by Google and Apple to remove a voting app from their app stores. This as Russia enters parliamentary elections this weekend. Some allege that the tech giants are siding with Putin against the Russian people. A source in Google said it removed the app in response to legal demands from Russian authorities. We were talking about this with Brian McDonald the other day. Yeah, the specific story I want to look into more, I want to understand more. But the general take that he was giving us was that Google and Apple are sort of thumbing their nose at the Russian government, right?
Yes.
That's what he was saying.
Yeah. I mean, we know it's very weird. It's almost as if our companies don't believe they need to follow the laws of the various countries, especially Russia. And I don't know if that's because of the Trump-Russia stuff or what's going on, but yeah, they're basically blowing off some of the rules and regulations that are in, leadership there. If that was here, we would never tolerate that.
Yeah. A court in Vienna is now hearing a case against the Austrian government. The case was brought by the family of a man who died last year at a ski resort that spread the coronavirus across the country. The family is arguing that the Austrian government did not do enough to curtail the spread of the virus. And with that, those were our earliest set of headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. A bunch of stuff to talk about here. I'm going to go back to the one that really caught my fancy in a whimsical sense or something like that. It's the devious licks one with TikTok. So kids are stealing a bunch of stuff from school. On the one hand, I actually kind of like it just because I hate school so much.
Funny.
But
very funny.
But, you know, kids shouldn't steal.
No, they shouldn't steal. I mean, what do you do with that, right? I mean, on some weird way, I don't necessarily think companies want themselves... Like, this is where the viral part of that comes in, right? Where it can go good or bad. And you get a good trend of paying it forward. You know, somebody says, oh, this is so nice. And you have viral videos of helping people out and everything else. Or you can have viral videos of who can steal a school bus? Who can steal a urinal? That is hilarious. How did they steal a urinal? That's impressive.
You know, well,
that's very impressive.
That's teaching ingenuity at school, at least, right?
That's just such an odd thing. And then for it to kind of just kick off. Yeah, man, it's very weird. I would imagine TikTok is not necessarily enamored by their platform being used for that. But like you made a point, it's like, but this is your bar. Like, this is the part where you stop. I mean, should this be the part where they stop? Like, if this was Shane Talk, and Shane Talk had his videos and everything else, people can put their things on the site, would this be the thing where you're like, all right, guys, I can't have you stealing stuff on my channel and having this being the bastion of theft, whatever? Or is it hands off? We're just a platform. Let it ride. You guys work that stuff out. What's the thing here?
I'm honest. I'm probably chaotic, neutral enough or something like that in the D&D, you know.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
To let it ride.
To be like, come on, guys, don't do that. And then to silently chuckle behind the scenes as I see them doing it. But objectively, it probably shouldn't be the case that they do this stuff. You know what I mean? And by the way, you say, if you had Shane Talk, this show is Shane Talk. No, I'm just kidding. It kind of rhymed.
I think it's funny, but it's unfortunate. I mean, this is the viral quality of social media, right? I mean, it's social, and people can end up in all sorts of things, and they're kids. And so kids already don't necessarily have the thing in their brain of risk assessment, good idea, bad idea. There's a belief that you can get away with a certain amount of stuff when you're a kid that you can't get away with, let's say, when you're 30.
Especially when it comes to this kind of like peer pressure-y, tacit imitation thing where it's like, oh, well, I can do better than that kid, even though it's, you know.
Because they're not going to put you in jail for it. If anything, they may suspend you. They may, at least I don't think they can put you in jail for it. Maybe stealing the school bus. Even that, like the school bus thing takes it up like another level. Somebody's going to steal a cop car eventually. And they're going to be like, I win.
Well, because it's stealing from school.
It has to be school. It has to be school.
You know, and maybe it's
school
like
police, maybe.
Yeah, exactly. That's where my mind went. School police. That would be the closest they could get to it, I think.
This is so funny.
A brief dystopian note before we move on to other headlines, and I do want it to be brief. But like, imagine the power TikTok and other social media applications spawned by, you know, increasingly large giants, big tech giants. Like, if okay. We're assuming right now that a lot of this stuff is sort of just spontaneous. You know, maybe somebody decided, okay, and certainly somebody decides, okay, this is going to be funny. Let's make this a bigger thing. But like, the presumption is that it's fairly natural. Right. It's organic. You know, it's coming up from the bottom. Yeah. It's a grassroots meme. But the concern that I have is like the non-grassroots meme that these tech giants discover they can create in the near future. They start putting this stuff out, and instead of just driving mass thought in the form of controlling what information we have access to, they also start driving mass action. And what does that lead to? Just a brief dystopian note. What could they get people to do? That's my concern.
I mean, I remember Facebook did that study where they were seeing if they could influence the opinions or feelings of people who were watching their site or watching their channel. And the answer was, of course you could. If you're controlling a person's reality in regards to what they see and interface with and everything else. And the catch becomes, are these campaigns or can these campaigns be directed in a way that is not haphazard? And the answer is yes, has to be. I mean, when you're looking at, let's say, protests, for example, well, you can use Facebook, Twitter, you can use all of these things to organize protests. Even when we're talking about other countries, where, if I'm not mistaken, was it Iran? Where the tech giants were allowing or trying to circumvent them shutting down the various internet in the various places. Because again, fomenting this kind of backlash and pushback. So yeah, I mean, it's a powerful industry. I mean, it's like, think of radio with any random Tom, Dick, and Harry that can push a particular opinion. That can go good or bad, though.
Now, Austin is saying that TikTok is basically the company that people will listen to on this.
Yeah.
He specifically mentioned the crate challenge. Were you following this one, Jamarl?
No.
For people, so, milk crates, like those plastic crates with yeah, you get my point. Plastic milk crates. So what people were doing is they were stacking them. So if you imagine it, I can show it to you. I'll try to figure out how to explain it to people auditorily over the air. You stack one, then two next to it, then three next to it, then four next to it, etc.
Yeah.
You're sort of creating like a pyramid, like a staircase that you walk up and then walk down.
Okay.
So you're going up, and the thing is, as you're walking up these milk crates, they're not balanced on anything. They're not held in place by anything other than each other, of course. So it's dangerous.
Yes, right.
And if you slip, you can potentially hurt yourself real bad. Some people were breaking bones and everything. Now, this was like a couple of weeks ago that I saw this meme going around.
Mm-hmm.
But Austin, from what you're saying, it seems like this has come to a stop, right? They've managed to so they have managed to effectively stop it. Interesting.
That is so wild to me. Wow. I guess this thing of being a kid, man. It's like you don't necessarily have this great appraisal of what, risk or something?
Oh, God, no.
There was another one, like Jackass. Do you remember when that used to come on? And they used to have to put the disclaimer, please don't do this, because people were emulating some of the things that they were doing when these guys first came out. Yeah, man, it's a potential for good or bad, and in this case, it's viral. I kind of want to go to the French government thing. It's like, you mad, bro? That's what I kept, when you were recounting the story, it's like, you mad, bro? The French government has canceled a meeting with the United States following the passage of a defense deal with Australia, which cut France out of a lucrative $90 billion contract to sell Australian submarines. France's foreign ministry has had earlier called the move the deal of the century and has since said it's a stab in the back by the American government. The United States announced the deal on Wednesday, which will sell Australia nuclear-powered submarines in partnership, which includes the United Kingdom. Basically, 3 eyes instead of 5 eyes. But France they have feelings about this. You mad, bro? This is a business thing, right? And they're considered a stab in the back. You consider this a stab in the back? I mean, it's an activity among nations. I don't. Does a stab in the back even apply here?
If we know that they were going to have that deal, it's a $90 billion deal. It's not a small ton of money. It's not. That's a decent chunk of money.
Yeah.
If we knew they were going to have this deal, I don't need to say if, and we forced them to cancel it. So I can see why they would take it that way. The way I see this is we're, for whatever reason, whether it's a counterbalance or what, we're trying to sort of reassert the Anglosphere thing, like the AUKUS, Australia, UK, US.
English speakers, yeah.
Exactly. That idea that, former Commonwealth nations. Of course, that would be the Five Eyes with the exception of the United States. Five Eyes aren't all in this deal. Canada and New Zealand are not part of it. But 3 out of the 5 nations of that's a bit. And what does that mean? We're willing to sacrifice a little bit of our relationship with the EU, apparently, right?
Or, I mean, maybe, yeah. I guess
France's main member nation.
UK is no longer part of the EU.
Exactly.
That's right.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's very weird. I mean, it could be also that it was just a superior product. It could be that.
Nuclear-powered submarines versus conventionally powered submarines, which is what France would have been providing.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's an issue of timescale. I mean, this is supposed to be 10, 20 years of some insane timescale. But, did we force them to do that? Or did they just acquiesce to it?
They did it of their own, of the Australian government. Well, who knows what else we have on the line or what else was said behind the scenes. But from our perspective, again, the way I see it, please, somebody, if you think I'm wrong, tell me I'm wrong or whatever. And I want to check it with guests as we talk about it. But, we're doing this because we want to reestablish that specific set of relationships. Yes. The UK is kind of, in some sense, out of the EU, left a little bit adrift. Yeah. You know what I mean? They have been. It's the story of the last couple of years. It's like, okay, bad terms with the EU. We're now having to deal with them as sort of 2 separate parties. And the Anglosphere thing, I wouldn't overlook, culturally, that history. But of course, with France, too, I saw, I think it was Ledra, the French foreign minister, who we were quoting without naming him earlier. I believe he was bringing up the idea, France has been our ally since like the Revolutionary War for hundreds of years.
They were backing us.
Against the Brits, to be clear.
That's right. That is right. Business deal, but there's no love lost in the context of business.
Yeah, but it looks like we're trying to play both sides of the table or something like that. And we'll see how that works.
Yeah. All right, let's do this. Let's go to a break. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back. in a moment.
Fault lines.
Radio Sputnik.
They're bringing drugs. They're bringing crime.
I like beer. Yeah, we drank beer.
Whoever's in charge, and I want the record.
Let's talk about that.
Discussing all the controversies and news across the disunited states of America. Tune in to Fault Lines every weekday from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern, only on Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in with the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. I was a bit conflicted on what story to go to today, but this one is kind of jumping out at me, so let's start here. Tomorrow, this was one of the headlines, tomorrow, Washington, D.C. will serve as a site for Justice for J6 rally, which will take place outside the Capitol. The rally is intended to serve as a defense for those who are charged or being charged in connection with the breach of the Capitol on January 6th. Fencing has been installed following January 6th, has been reinstated in advance of tomorrow's rally. The word, however, is that far-right and right-wing groups have warned against attending the rally. Now, the reasoning is they believe that this is some kind of psyop or that this is going to be used to basically get people further into trouble. I find this to be extremely interesting. Now, from the standpoint of the initial rally for January 6th, you had a president that was in office. That particular president was trying to push various people around him to not certify the election results. You even had Pence, who initially thought was more of a bulwark against this. You find out Pence actually did want to acquiesce, but whatever he wanted to do, he actually did stand down. The crowd itself seems to be disorganized and raided the Capitol for the most part. There are questions about whether it's a coup or not, and we've had the debate and we've had the argument back and forth. I don't think the various people, however, at the Capitol was a coup. I do think what Donald Trump wanted to do in his highest aspirations, however, was. But the catch is the people at the Capitol, this raiding of the Capitol, this attacking the various members and scaring the members of Congress, running around with the news, pipe bombs, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, you got the backlash with the federal government, people screaming at it to do something, goes around and starts locking up people all across the United States that were participating at this particular event. So you can imagine, especially when there was, let's say, allegations that either the FBI was instigating or, let's say, the elements or the intelligence elements was instigating activities of the various people who were there. Look, whether that's true or whether that's not true, and I'm one of those people who thought they should have had a far more thorough investigation, not just from the standpoint of intelligence, but also to the various members of Congress to see if there was any detailed interaction between those things. You can't necessarily look at that on its face and say it's entirely wrong. I mean, if you go back and look at some of the, like COINTELPRO or the way they used to do many other groups that were considered to be anti-government groups, there was this, let's say, push to undermine various groups, either by putting plants in or by antagonizing elements of the group in order to have the groups destroy or attack each other. And so would that necessarily change just because it's a far-right group? And I don't necessarily think the answer to that is yes. I think it could potentially be that way, hence the idea of an investigation. But the key point here is that this rally is going to take place once again tomorrow. And if the first rally turned out the way it was, is there a large, let's say, concern that something similar would happen for this one? The first time this happened, I made the point that it was going to be seen as a success. You had a situation where all of these people screaming Donald Trump's name, basically raided the Capitol. And something that seemed untouchable and far away and remote was all of a sudden brought down to reality where it was indeed touchable. It wasn't that remote. You did have Congress members running, scaring for their lives. And tomorrow will be a recreation on some level of the very first event. We have to wait and see. I mean, we're in D.C. This is just kind of around the block from where we are. They're putting back up the fencing. If you remember, they had huge amounts of military personnel that were there at the time. And a large part of that could have also been that you had a president screaming bloody murder, that he was the person who was the real winner of that race. And a lot of people backing him in that wrong, horrible assertion of such. This also gets into this notion of just the politics in general, where we've gotten to this odd point where elections are no longer accepted in the sense of one person wins, one person loses. John Wayne had this famous comment or this famous quote about John F. Kennedy saying, "I didn't vote for him, but he's my president and I hope he does well." And over time, we've seen this kind of erosion of this notion of the concession or the concession speech, one of the most important aspects of our political process. You and I run in a race. We have a race. I say all sorts of bad things about you. You say all sorts of bad things about me. And at the end of that race, one of us wins. The other person comes out, tells his supporters, I know I said bad things about the person. However, this person is the constitutional authority in this moment. He has the legitimacy based on the people who put him in that office. And whether or not I wanted him to win or not is besides the point. He won. I'm going to bid you good day. I'm going to go get me a sandwich and I'm going to leave. That's not the way our politics works anymore. And Shane and I often have this conversation about this kind of what seems a degradation of the way we engage with one another, a degradation of the politics. If you go back to Merrick Garland, for example, when Obama tried to get Merrick Garland in, and the Republican Party got to the point of just saying, okay, well, yeah, we'll just, maybe the Supreme Court can die on the vine, where they wasn't even going to allow him to get his Supreme Court pick in. Now, again, looking at this notion of what does it mean for America or the Constitution and everything else, America as a concept is supposed to be, by definition, higher than the aspirations or the individual aspirations of a particular party or a particular individual. And that no longer seems to be the case. Even from Merrick Garland, you go to somebody like from Clinton and Trump. And whereas Donald Trump wins it, they go with this notion that the Russians picked Donald Trump up and carried him over the finish line, with the obvious rationale being you didn't win legitimately. Yes, he was able to take the presidency, but the entire time you had nearly half of the country or a large percentage of the country acting as if he wasn't president or he was lesser of a president or that he shouldn't have the powers of the president, as if civilian authority didn't necessarily carry the day because they didn't necessarily like what the civilians chose. Whether or not it was a direct hit against the electoral process is almost secondary to the point that it was definitely a direct undermining of a person winning the race. They even went as far as to try to get him to pass sanctions, which again, if you're passing sanctions saying that you helped me win, you basically are repudiating your own win. You're basically making as if you didn't win yourself. They did this for 3 and 4 years, undermining the presidency in and of itself. Biden gets in office. Trump does the exact same thing, where in this time, instead of Trump hitting the minds of individuals, Trump hits the electoral system directly. It's a fraud. It's cheating. They're gaming the system. The pillow guys running around talking about Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, and the ghosts are undermining the election results that Biden didn't necessarily win. But the point I'm trying to make here is a pattern of degradation of a political process. Whereas at one point, it was understood that America and the concept of America mattered more than individual aspirations of particular parties or individuals, to the point where we are now, where the only thing that matters seems to be to win. When you get unyielding opposition in the way that they were saying against Obama, I believe it was the night that Obama got inaugurated or whatever, where all of these guys were sitting around saying unyielding and complete opposition. Doesn't matter that he won. It doesn't matter that the public was trying to get him in. It doesn't even matter what is in the interest of the public and the people we're supposed to represent. What matters is that we win, that we ding the opponent, that we hurt the opposition, even when that hurting the opposition is undermining the government and us, meaning the American citizenry ourselves. We're in a weird space in this country, and I don't see the turn, meaning I don't see the rejuvenation. And people can come up with all sorts of reasons as to why this is taking place. You could say the massive amounts of corruption. You can make a case that says, you know, as people get more fraught and as resources get distributed to higher versus lower, and you get this kind of weakening of societal bonds and everything else, that you create a certain hysteria in the country. You can even make the argument that the level of corruption has gotten to the point where it is so high stakes that America itself matters less. Whatever reasoning you want to go to it, I'm more so trying to put my finger on the pulse of this and saying it is a horrible path, and it is a path that will be fraught with all sorts of problems going forward. I've been in countries where the people don't end the election, where there is no concession. I remember being in Kenya where they made the point to me, they say, yeah, we hate elections here. And they're making this point basically that when there's an election, there's usually chaos because one side never actually concedes the race. And so instead of having a large group of the public saying, okay, yeah, I don't like this guy, but at the very least, this guy won, he has the legitimacy of the office, neither side concedes. Dishonest actors can easily get themselves into the mind frame of, well, that guy really didn't win. That's not a real victory. That's not a real win. In which case, you have millions and tens of millions of people that believe something that is self-interest entirely, not true. And yet, it's there nonetheless. January 6th was a horrid, horrid day in this country's history. But let's be clear. It is unclear what this is going to be in regards to a follow-up to that particular event. And as we said earlier, many groups have basically warned that this is some kind of psyop and have been telling people to not attend the rally. I'll end it on this part. There has to be a turn here at some point. We can't keep going in this particular direction where who wins, the electoral system, or even the country itself matters less than the individual aspirations of party or people. There has to be a turn. Shane, I don't see that turn. This notion that, you know, a person wins, the other person concedes, this idea that America matters more than just the individual aspirations, they used to be that way. I mean, the John Wayne quote is perfect, where he's like, he's not my president. I mean, I didn't vote for him, but he's my president, and I hope he does well. And that would be unheard of today. Unheard of. What are your thoughts?
It is true. That would be unheard of. Well, we wouldn't hear about it necessarily because the atmosphere in the media seems to continuously want us to fight. To want us to fight on either side, although one side does dominate on mainstream media, and I'd argue the other side sort of dominates online in a weird way. But hey, that's the story, right? That's the sort of underlying culture war that we're told is driving all this stuff. My take on it is that this is long-term, you know, institutional, generational decay. And by generations, I don't mean necessarily the generations of people. I mean systematic, bureaucracies handing themselves down generationally from one line to the next, and not really having an idea of how to maintain or improve the systems that they were given. Instead, overreaching, trying to do things that don't work, failing to do things, being corrupted and co-opted by outside forces, all of that together. And
that is the question. How do you maintain a system to rejuvenate it as it goes forward? Yeah. If that makes sense.
Totally. That's how I see it. Yeah. Because unlike, you can only, a family isn't quite right, because a family clearly does not have nearly as strong an organizational structure. And I'm not an aristocrat. I don't, that's not how I think about these things. But it's not like a person. We live an individual life. These institutions have to hand themselves down. They have to create an inheritance in the same way that you might think kings would have, and the kings, in fact, did. They would have to think, okay, who's going to be the next one? What's the line of succession going to be? Of course, in our presidential context, the line of succession is given out every 4 years, or sooner if there's an impeachment or somebody dies, that kind of thing. But the point is, it's supposed to happen very, very regularly. And the same thing is true of our bureaucracies. But there's no, as far as I can tell, they're not doing that well. And it's like this is a general complaint of mine. I don't think we actually have a science, or an art for that matter, for understanding how to make these things function. That's as sociologists and anthropologists, more sociologists than anthropologists, but they're both, I don't like the fields as they stand right now, but those are both fields that could have a chance at solving this kind of problem. I sort of detached from the specific thing, of course, which we're going to be talking about again in just a little bit, which is the Justice for January 6th rally coming up tomorrow and the events of January 6th in general. And like you were saying, the long-term problem, which is our inability to accept who's president, and the president's factually getting worse. Both of those, you can't detach them from each other.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I would argue that what's really the cause for that is just the institutions themselves aren't working. And the institutions have their own culture.
Yes, they do. I guess that's the question, right? It's like something starts, and whatever the impetus that starts it, there's a huge amount of energy and drive for that thing to be, let's say, somewhat pristine, relatively decent. The brain trust of it is intact. And then you get X number of generations down, and it looks like a pale comparison of itself. It's withered. It doesn't necessarily have the integrity that it did when it first started. And yeah, I think you hit it on the head. This notion of how do you sustain something over the course of multiple generations, meaning from the standpoint of an institution, especially when that has to be handed down. There's going to be turnover in regards to the people who are going to be there. And at some point, what does it look like after 100 years, 200 years?
Yes. 2 quick points that I just want to add in real quick. We have our guest. I want to make sure we get to him soon. One very quick point. I'm not saying that America was perfect. I'm not saying that there's some bastion in our history that we should be going back to. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying there was a promised land in our history. But 2, I think if you look at, just take World War II, for instance, the period around World War II, compare like Eisenhower, for instance, to any recent president we've had. And I would argue just in that person, that president and the presidents of that time were arguably consistently better than any president we've had in a while. They were responsible for atrocities, some of them. I'm not trying to push that off to the side. But in terms of their ability to get things done. More competence. Yeah. That's it. And you can, we look at the presidents, they're the figureheads, we notice them, but the same would hold true of the bureaucracies behind them as well. And it's long-term decline. That's my point. Yeah. There's something to go back to. There's something to restore, I would hope. We've got to go into our break. We're going to be coming back with Daniel Lazar. For those listening, he's an independent journalist, author. You're going to be listening to us talking about the John Durham investigation, as they have found an indictment, a single indictment. This was the Durham probe trying to investigate the origins and spread of Russiagate, looking into corruption, as the Mueller report, again, got effectively nothing done. Well, it seems like the Durham probe is in the same camp as the Miller camp. We're going to be talking about this with Daniel Lazar on the other side of this short break. You're listening to Fault Lines. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. No surrender.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And Shane said in the beginning, we're going to go into John Durham's investigation. And John Durham has basically put someone up, I think the gentleman's name is Sussman, for potential indictment, Michael Sussman. Now, this has to do with a statement he made on September 19th, 2016, between himself and the FBI General Counsel James Baker, where he would not necessarily tell that he was working in part with Hillary Clinton and the political, let's say, machinations that were going on behind the scenes in this. Merrick Garland has the ability to override John Durham on this, but up to this point has not done so. And so at this point, we have a few questions. Is it significant? Is it thin? Meaning from the standpoint of what they're going after him for? How significant is it if it's not somewhat of a thin prosecution? And so let's get into the details of this. Talk about it. We're joined with Daniel Lazar. Daniel Lazar is an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. Daniel, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You know, this Durham investigation has been going on seemingly forever behind the scenes. And I remember when Durham got the ability, I believe, where it became somewhat of a criminal prosecution, kind of raised eyebrows. Well, at this point, they're basically, he wants to indict a cybersecurity lawyer on charges of making a false statement to the FBI. Considering, you know, the investigation and everything else into the origins of Russiagate, et cetera, how significant is this?
I think it's very significant. Michael Sussman, the lawyer who's been indicted, was at the center of the early Russiagate, brouhaha. And what essentially he is alleged to have done was to have met with the FBI without disclosing his ties to the Clinton campaign. His law firm was the official law firm for the Clinton campaign.
Perkins and Cole.
And fed them information which had been fed to him first by an unnamed tech executive. The indictment doesn't say who that tech executive is, but the most likely source is guess is it's Dmitry Alperovich, the chief technical officer of CrowdStrike, which is the company that uncovered the alleged Russian hack
that the DNC had hired.
Computers, yes, in the first place. And so Sussman is alleged to have fed this information, which his client had dug up about Trump's links with a Moscow bank called the Alpha Bank, to the FBI without disclosing, his ties to the Clinton campaign. And this news came out, hit the press, by the way. It was obviously leaked by Sussman or Sussman's firm just 1 week prior to the November 2016 election. The charge proved to be completely spurious, and it kind of fell off the news pages 4 or 5 months later, but the damage was done. So it seems to be a classic case of a Clinton operative sort of secretly linking or duping the FBI into investigating a non-existent Trump-Russia tie in order to drum up anti-Trump, furor just immediately prior to the election. So I think that's very, very serious and goes to the heart of what Russiagate entailed.
I agree that it would, but here's why I feel like this is not just too little, too late, but simply not enough, not nearly enough. This is one guy who's not a part of the FBI. He's, he was working with the Clintons, but he's an outside operative. But a lot of what people were very concerned about with Russiagate.
Former federal prosecutor, by the way.
What'd you say?
The former federal prosecutor, by the way.
Oh, thank you. But he's not. But here's the thing: this isn't an institutional conspiracy, which it seemed pretty clear there was. In other words, the point of the Durham probe wasn't to swat away flies. It was to try to get at the heart of what went wrong with Russiagate, which was a years-long conspiracy. Conspiracy theory in the tinfoil hat sense, promulgated by a cast of media figures, politicians, clearly, members of the FBI, members of the quote-unquote deep state, however you want to refer to it. None of that seems to have been unearthed or seriously addressed in the course of undergoing this probe. And that's where me looking at this, I'm like, okay, I get it. Good. You got a guy. But you got one guy. And there's not just one guy, very clearly. What happened to, I think you see, what do you think about that, Daniel?
Well, no, I think you're jumping the gun. I mean, I think first of all, it's one guy, but it's one guy who was at the heart of this whole operation. It very likely involves another guy, Alperovich, who was the person who uncovered the alleged Russian hack, and they allegedly duped the FBI. Now the question as to whether the FBI was really duped. Or whether, the FBI itself wanted to be duped is another question, a very important question that the indictment doesn't address. But they've zeroed in on Sussman. The next step is to zero in on Alperovich, and then to figure out, how wide this operation went, and exactly what the FBI's role was. Was it duped? Did it want to be duped? Was it encouraging Perkins Coie, Sussman's law firm, to dupe it? These are all very, very important questions. But I think this is a very solid indictment, which goes to the heart of the alleged conspiracy.
If it's a start to a series of other indictments, then I'll be like, okay, now we're seeing something. But real quick, just a news headline: Mark Milley, the general chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who, of course, news broke, earlier this week. Basically, he had given, without talking to Trump, he'd given a private call to China several times in which he told them that we wouldn't strike first. That was, of course, a big story. Anyway, he has since said that doing that was, quote, within the duties and responsibilities, end quote, of his job. We were having a conversation earlier this week with Scott Ritter about, whether he'd be court-martialed, whether or not that was justified, that kind of thing. He's basically sort of preempting that, saying, no, this was within, this is something I was supposed to do. Anyway, Jamarl.
Oh, well, yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Okay. So you think this is going to be a wider investigation, that this is not basically stopping with him? I mean, and to put it in perspective, right here, Durham, former U.S. Attorney for Connecticut, was appointed to examine how the FBI, the CIA, and other agencies investigated Russia's interference in 2016 election and potential connections between Russia and the Trump campaign. He negotiated a guilty plea from an FBI lawyer who was sentenced to probation after admitting lying on a surveillance warrant application. Well, I guess the question becomes, how deep does this rabbit hole go? And if Sussman, like you said, this is just the start, though. And the catch becomes, how far does this actually go? I mean, do you think they're ever going to get to the point of investigating the organizations themselves for potential malfeasance in the way that they investigated this case?
I can't answer that. But all I know is this is an indictment which goes to the heart of the conspiracy, and that it involves two major figures in the conspiracy. And as to whether other indictments will follow, I have no way of knowing. I don't have any secret ties to the FBI, unlike Michael Sussman. So I don't know what's going to follow from this. But I think this is a solid indictment which goes to the heart of the conspiracy, and therefore it is a very significant development. That's all I can say.
Yeah. I can, on the one hand, I can totally see what you're saying. But on the other hand, I'll put it like this, is another way of approaching the situation. I don't know what this is functionally going to change in terms of the problems that were clearly endemic that caused Russiagate, which was not just a single person relaying information in a way that he wasn't supposed to when he was representing a client, but an institutional conspiracy working against the president, spreading demonstrably untrue claims over the course of years, literally a kind of tacit velvet coup. I don't mean to use the title of your book, but, a sort of a way of adding instability to a president that a lot of people in the White House, most people in the administration really didn't like. That was what that was. And how that happened, I think, is ultimately, how that happened, what went wrong, what's wrong in our institutions that let that be possible. That's like the real story here. And this is one single person. Michael Sussman is a single outside player, even though he was a former prosecutor. He's Perkins Coie. He was outside player at this point, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, Russiagate was an extraordinary development. Clearly, the CIA was working behind the scenes to keep this thing going. It was a classic CIA destabilization campaign of the sort which America has carried out in countless other countries. But the basic technique was was involved with the same. Someone goes to the FBI and says, "Hey, I have a hot tip that Trump is secretly communicating with a Moscow bank with links to the Kremlin." And then that same person, leaks to the press. Hey, the FBI is investigating charges that Trump had secret links to a bank with a Kremlin connection.
And all the while concealing their political motivations behind their actions itself.
The press then goes wild, and 1,000 other stories are then pumped out, and the same pattern happens again and again and again. So for basically 2 years, we were hit with these nonstop 24/7 headlines about one link, another link. This person is linked with that person who's linked with the Kremlin, who's linked with this, and out of this whole thing came a nonstop hysteria and a significant political destabilization, where Trump was nearly run out of office. Top Justice Department officials were discussing invoking the 25th Amendment to declare him mentally incompetent, unable to carry out his presidential functions, and so it was a classic CIA destabilization campaign. But here we've sort of may have uncovered one small link in that campaign.
I hear you. Well, and this is, again, what it comes down to. I'm going to take us into a break here. If we see more coming from this, and I hope it will be a lot more, then that'll be a great thing. But right now, I don't see that. We'll see. We'll see. Maybe I'm too pessimistic here. I'm going to take us into a brief break. We're going to be joined by Daniel Lazare. When we come back, as we are now, of course, he's an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. Follow Daniel on Twitter at DHLazare. Find his column on theweeklyworker.co.uk, strategic-culture.org, and many other outlets. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Breaking news, expert analysis, and exclusive stories, all in one place. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We are joined by Daniel Lazare, independent journalist and author. We're continuing the conversation, but I want to pivot slightly to another related aspect in recent declines in American democracy. We're going to be talking about the January 6th rally and the Justice for J6 rally coming up tomorrow. Daniel, I believe we've spoken about this with you multiple times before, but I'll just do a quick little test here. I'll just ask you, where do you stand on January 6th? People have a bunch of different opinions about that. What do you think that event was, and what do you think it is in the context of, America's political and cultural discourse? Daniel.
Oh, I think it was a genuine attempt at a coup d'etat. I mean, I think Trump definitely wanted to use the rally, use the mob to pressure the House into essentially either suspending the formal count or declaring a state of emergency. I mean, Trump didn't quite know what he was up to, what he's going to do. I mean, Trump is a great, improviser, but somehow he wanted to interrupt the formal vote ratification process with the intent of grabbing the presidency for himself. So I think that fairly qualifies as an attempted coup. But I agree, it shows deepening structural instability in the U.S. system. I mean, I think that the 230-year-old machinery is just, creaking to a halt. It's frozen. It's a frozen republic. To quote another one of my books, and it's just showing its age. It's showing its obsolescence. It's showing its complete dysfunctionality.
We were having a conversation earlier about propagating institutions going forward in time and the way that those institutions seem to degrade. And I guess this is kind of what January 6th looks like to me. It seems like for Trump's highest aspiration would have been to remain in office. And he tried to push various people around to get him to do that. Whether or not it looked comical, whether or not there was a certain degree of incompetence to it, it did seem like that's what he wanted to do. From your standpoint, is there a way to propagate institutions over the course of time where those institutions don't degrade? Or is it just a situation where it always is a renewal? It's always something that's going to have to basically fall apart before it's put back together?
I mean, institutions have a mind of their own. So they kind of carry on. But the problem is that they have a mind of their own, and therefore they are not under Democratic small d control. But in the case of the electoral process in the U.S., I mean, it was based on the 12th Amendment, which was ratified in 1803. I mean, scholars looking at the amendment can see all kinds of holes in it, all kinds of structural defections, which Trump wanted to take advantage of. But it seems to me obvious that anybody who wants to run a proper democracy, can't base it on a 200-year-old law, which obviously is in need of updating and modernization. But the same U.S. Constitution makes that impossible. So we're sort of stuck with this ancient machinery, which is obviously defective, and wants to go where it wants to go, not where we, the people, want it to go.
It has been held in place for a very long time by the legal structures of our Constitution, and we have had conversations with you before where you have made your point very clear. We need to rewrite this stuff. We need to go back and sort of into the the gutters and into the pipeworks and redo the machinery of how this works and what kinds of bureaucracies it's going to let us create. And in my own way, I agree. Although when it comes to some of the specific policy proposals we were talking about, I disagree. But hey, that's the point of conversation in a democracy, or a republic at least. But coming back to January 6th. I disagree in my own way. I think it was idiotic. I think it was a mistake. I do think it was bad for American democracy, but I think it was more an expression of what's bad in American democracy than an exacerbation of it. Although it was that too. But with Trump, I mean, a second biggest crisis of his presidency behind COVID, I would argue, and both of those came in the last year. And he had many crises during his presidency. We were just talking about one during the last segment. I've said the things I feel like I need to say. January 6th equals bad. Trump's handling of it equals bad, etc. But moving past that, I also feel like it's been overblown. And of course, it's going to set us up, if we follow that thread too carefully, if the political system and our media uses it, as they seem to be so want to do, as a justification for restricting information to us, for putting us in a box effectively. I'm speaking extremely generally, but I'm worried that that's where it goes, in the same way that the Patriot Act, of course, following 9/11, was ultimately used to extend state power, not to protect the citizens first and foremost. And that's the way I'm looking at the event tomorrow too. I don't think we'll actually see anything. What's weird to me is all of the right-wing groups, who people would be worried are going to use this as an event to spark another attempted coup, quote unquote. All the right-wing groups are telling people to stay far away. They're calling it a false flag. And when I say all the right-wing groups, I mean the big ones. This is what I was reading in, no less right-wing an outlet than NBC News the other day. So isn't there some kind of doesn't that put the lie in it? Doesn't that belie something? Or, doesn't that reveal something about what's going on here? The right-wing groups aren't going to attend. They're so squicked about it because they feel like there's going to be an event that was orchestrated by the government that they're not willing to go, which is what a lot of people think about January 6th in the first place. So I don't know whether or not there was, but doesn't that show that the beast that we've been painting doesn't look exactly like we painted it? Daniel.
Well, yeah, out of dysfunctionality comes more dysfunctionality. The system ain't working, and the system is unable to get to the bottom of really what happened on January 6th. So they engage in a good deal of mutual finger pointing. Look at the whole thing reminds me of that great scene in the Caine Mutiny, where Humphrey Bogart's on the stand and he pulls out those steel balls and says they were all betraying him. The Democrats spent the previous 4 years trying to destabilize the Trump administration. And then Trump just wanted try to destabilize the electoral process in order to prevent the Democrats from taking over. So destabilization leads to more destabilization, which leads to more dysfunctionality, and all the machinery threatens to collapse in a heap. So yeah, I have no idea what's going to happen tomorrow. I don't have a crystal ball. I'm probably the only one political prognosticator who does not have a crystal ball, because everyone else is sure of what's going to happen. But yeah, I think that the Democrats are trying to turn this into a political campaign to discredit, the Republicans in preparation for 2022. It's yet again another political football being tossed back and forth. Adam Schiff is involved in the investigation, and that alone tells you the whole thing is a complete political farce. So yeah, I mean, no one knows where it's going, and yes, I agree with you. I have little faith that wherever it's going is going to wind up in a good place.
Daniel, that's unfortunate. Because yeah, I think I agree with both of you in the sense of this doesn't seem to be going in good areas, and it doesn't seem to be a turn either. Like, it seems that at some point, if things were going to right themselves or things were going to resolve, there would have to be some point in which the boat starts to turn, or at the very least, you could see in advance something is taking place that is going to push things in a different direction. And it doesn't seem that way. It decidedly just seems to continuously get worse.
I quite agree, and I think the Republicans are pursuing a very, very clever strategy, which is constitutional, by the way, in that it derives from the U.S. Constitution. And that is using the state powers. They control what, 3/4 of the state legislatures in the country. They're using that power in order to set the 2024 elections up for a fall. Essentially, they're trying to prepare the legal basis for what will be a far more effective series of legal challenges to the electoral process in 2024, much more than they were in 2020.
Daniel, can you please unpack that? What do you mean by that?
Well, the thrust, just as with the Texas abortion bill, the thrust of the Texas electoral bill was to empower poll observers to interrupt and challenge the voting procedures as they're taking place. Okay, and so this means giving power to Republican poll watchers to talk about the voting booths and the counting rooms, interrupting the procedures, mounting electoral legal challenges on the spot, and preparing the basis for ongoing legal challenges, which will halt the counting, on the spot, and that could happen in a dozen or more states. So if that happens in 2024, the entire process could be thrown into turmoil, and I think that is clearly what the GOP strategy is at this point, to be able to sort of in 2024 mount legal challenges that essentially throw the election into the courts and then into the House, where Republicans, because they control a majority of state delegations, would essentially choose the next president. And it's that last procedure is according to the 12th Amendment passed in 1803, which has never been revised in the 217 years since, or 18 years since, and should be revised. But I think that is clearly the strategy that's shaping up. So the Republicans are pursuing a very clever, but what could be a very effective constitutional strategy, and my emphasis in the word constitutional.
Well, it's a disaster. I mean, it's a crisis of, governance at that point. Wow. Daniel, thank you for joining us, man. We really appreciate it. Daniel Lazar is an independent journalist and author, best known as a critic of the U.S. Constitution, American politics, government, and social policy in general. He's written a number of books, including From Moses to ISIS, The Intelligent Heretic's Guide to Monotheism, The Frozen Republic, The Velvet Coup, and America's Undeclared War. You can follow Daniel on Twitter at DHLazar and find his column on theweeklyworker.co.uk, strategicculture.org, and many others. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I'm your ever vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That means, all things being equal, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get into the headlines. Disturbing conversation this morning with Lazar, but a really interesting one. In the news, about 154,897 new COVID cases were reported in the United States yesterday, and there were 3,415 deaths reported. Over the past week, there's been an average of 150,366 cases per day, a decrease of 9% from the average 2 weeks earlier. 54% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated, and 63% of residents have has taken at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 41,790,700 Americans and killed 670,231 human beings in this country. Also, I want to point out 3,415 deaths yesterday. That is more than 9/11. And there is no signs that those deaths are going to abate anytime soon. And if anything, when you're getting schools and kids going to schools, many of kids aren't necessarily vaccinated or anything else, that number seems like it's only going to get worse. So, today, the FDA's Independent Advisory Committee will convene to debate the Pfizer booster shots. They will be discussing if the booster is safe enough for widespread use and whether it's necessary and effective at improving protection levels against COVID-19. The vote is non-binding, but the FDA generally follows the advice of the board. We had a conversation on the booster shots, I think it was a few days ago. Quite good. After Angela Underwood's husband went into the ICU for COVID-19, she demanded that they use ivermectin to treat him. The staff refused, and Underwood took them to court. Underwood, being a registered nurse, believed it was a good option for emergency use in this case. It wasn't. The judge delivered a scathing resolution denying her claim and calling out people who have promoted and supported deworming drug as an effective treatment for battling COVID-19. Good for that judge. Good on that judge. Tomorrow, Washington, D.C. will serve as a site for the Justice for J6 or January 6th rally, which will take place outside the Capitol. The rally is intended to serve as a defense for those who are being charged in connection with the breach on the Capitol on January 6th. Fencing that has been installed following January 6th has been reinstalled in advance of tomorrow's rally. The word, however, is that far-right and right-wing groups have warned against attending the rally. Attorney Michael Sussman has been indicted for allegedly lying to the FBI regarding the disproven Trump-Russia probe. Sussman faces one count of false statements in his conversation with the FBI where he discussed possible ties between Russian lender Alpha Bank and computer server at the Trump organization. And of course, part of the problem here is that he didn't disclose that he was working with the Clinton Foundation. Basically, this was political, and they were passing information to the FBI. A viral TikTok trend known as devious licks is hitting school districts all across the country. The trend has kids steal random things from their schools, then posting the results to the app. What started off as mouse pads and soap dispensers has turned into urinals, projectors, whiteboards, and even a school bus stolen by students. Schools have responded with strict punishment and various new policies, like locking bathrooms during class times. TikTok has stated that they will be banning videos that feature this particular challenge. A cave in Missouri full of 1,000-year-old indigenous artwork is just sold for $2.2 million in an auction, a direct slap in the face of the Osage Nation, who hoped to buy the land in order to protect and preserve the sacred site of their ancestors. The cave was the site of sacred rituals and burials. It is also more than 290 prehistoric glyphs, hieroglyphic symbols used to represent sound or meanings, making it the largest collection of indigenous people polychrome paintings in Missouri. The French government has canceled a meeting with the United States following the passage of a defense deal with Australia, which cuts France out of a lucrative $90 billion contract to sell Australia submarines. France's foreign minister has earlier called the move the deal of the century and has since said this was a stab in the back by the American government. The United States announced the deal on Wednesday, which will sell Australia nuclear-powered submarines in a partnership which includes the United Kingdom. South Africa's former president, Jacob Zuma, lost his bid to overturn his 15-month jail sentence for contempt of court after failing to appear at a corruption inquiry. He had argued that the sentence was excessive, saying it endangered his health. Zuma is 79 years old. At that age, pretty much anything will endanger your health, I'd imagine, right? Allies of Alexei Navalny are responding negatively to the decision by Google and Apple to remove a voting app from their app store as Russia enters parliamentary elections, with some alleging that the tech giants are siding with Putin against the Russian people. A source in Google said it removed the app in response to legal demands from the Russian authorities. A court in Vienna is now hearing a case against Austrian government, and the case was brought by the family of a man who died last year at a ski resort that spread the coronavirus across the country. The family is arguing that the Austrian government did not do enough to curtail the spread of the virus. Very interesting. Lucid Air's electric sedan challenges Tesla with a final range rating of 520 miles on a full charge. The Tesla Model S long range only boasts 405 miles in this range. Tesla is working on other things, however, like freight semi-trucks coming in 2022. The truck will reach 0 to 60 in 20 seconds with a full 80,000-pound load. For contrast, it takes a modern diesel truck nearly 5 minutes to hit this feat. Electric cars are getting wild, man, and that's in quotes. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are your headlines.
A parenthetical comment from Austin, I believe.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's the torque. The electric cars, it's the torque in the battery that lets them do it. They have torque that the gas engines just don't.
You know, I keep saying that is going to be a game changer. I mean, imagine for the moment that these guys, Tesla is working on multiple things at once. The battery powered, the automated driving. There's something else that they're working on. But all of those things are, I don't want to say disruptive technology, but they have the ability or the potential, especially the automation, of transforming what we consider to be our just typical way of operating. Imagine cars that are either solar power or, that immediately just go from point A to point B in this kind of automatic fashion. And when you get to the point where there are less people on the streets and the cars are driving themselves, I would wager it's probably would even be safer. The problem is that you have this kind of unequal scenario where you have cars that are machines and then you have people who are driving, and these two things don't necessarily know what each other are doing, but you can conceive of a situation where the cars are basically talking to each other and organizing their traffic around the country or around the world. This is going to be a significant change, and I don't necessarily think we've accommodated what this means. Like, think of Uber, Lyft, think of the travel or delivery companies, think of the taxi cab drivers, and each and every one of those companies has an impetus to get rid of the drivers and basically have a robot to do that job. The robot is not going to get tired. It's not going to get it blue. It's not going to complain about its girlfriend. It's not going to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You basically just have this all-seeing, all-driving thing that doesn't get tired, doesn't do anything else. It just goes. The catch becomes, again, what happens to the people in that situation? Because you can't just say we're not going to push this because of people. No, it becomes a societal thing of like, how does your society accommodate this technological innovation? And on some level, that's been a question that we've had for God knows how long, right? But we've never necessarily answered it in a straightforward way. And in this very particular capacity, we're going to be confronted with that. Whatever I think of Andrew Yang, on that specific point about our society is changing, we need to be able to accommodate that change. He is right.
100% true. And you know what? I'll put on my dystopian hat again, which I'm sorry I'm putting on a lot these days, but I'm trying to see the light, and sometimes you need to go through the darkness to see the light, I think. What's going to determine it? What is our value? What is our economic value? This is a big question that Marxists would always ask with the labor theory of value. What is the value of a human being doing something for somebody else? How do you measure that? And how is the price of that, or the value as it's perceived, changed by these other economic forces and, systematic the nature of economies that leads to what we now call oppression, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But if the value of a human being is going down, which it seems it is if we're being displaced by automation, what does that do to human rights and human life and how humans are treated by their government? What does that do to how we're treated by our governments? If our value, our economic value, our ability to produce GDP is suddenly dwarfed, for the vast majority of at least, by cheap, increasingly cheap, ever better automated systems. Again, putting on a dystopian hat, anybody who wants to push back, please do, because I'm looking for the light. But
well, in this situation, I don't know if, okay, I think it's a misnomer to look at human beings from the standpoint of value. We work and there's, economic output and everything else because we need to. Like for the longest time, at least up until, let's say, our current day and age, you didn't work, you didn't eat. I mean, the very act of just feeding yourself or having somewhere to live, build that house, feed that food, all of these things required some level of energy and work in order to make that stuff go.
Except if you're a member of the aristocracy.
Well, right. Unless you're a member of the aristocracy. I guess the point that I'm getting at is this notion of the value of a human being shouldn't necessarily be measured entirely in this notion of economic output. But again, this becomes an ideological thing, right? Like, what are people worth? But I don't think that should be put into monetary denominations. I think that's, the horse and buggy versus a car versus an automated car. And it's like, well, yeah, of course. I mean, the whole point of having technology is to make our lives on some level easier, to produce more, to create more surplus with less energy into the process. And so to me, I would say it's a good thing. I think the problem becomes, how do we accommodate it? And I don't think we know that yet. Like, I don't think we've hit our heads on this thing of how do we gently or gracefully incorporate the fact that robots and AI could actually do much of the labor that we have people doing today. And would segments of the population feel some kind of way that other segments don't necessarily have to work to do? Well, of course they will. I mean, it's the way we function for God knows how long. And that changeover, I don't know what the changeover looks like. At some point, whether it's, I think Richard Wolff would argue, well, you should cut down on the amount of time people work. So instead of them working until they were 65, maybe you work until you're 45 or 50 and you kind of accommodate it that way in order to try to incorporate in your society. But it doesn't seem like that stuff is even on the marquee right now.
It isn't, but also think about the dynamics of that. Say you have a society in which there's a basic minimum wage and there's a minority of people who are qualified to be programmers and administrators, who are qualified to be the most prestigious of creatives or whatever. There's a natural hierarchy built into it. Everybody has a basic minimum wage, but the vast majority of people who receive that minimum wage do no public productive work. There's very little sign of what they do.
It's like you've bifurcated your society.
Yeah. Now, what's that political system going to look like? What's that culture going to look like? What are the different groups, the different parties going to think about each other? I can ask the question. I can't answer it. But my point is, I feel like the resentment that a lot of people feel towards people on welfare and the sense of like spiritual moralistness of like, I just want to work, man. I actually don't want to be on welfare. I actually do want a job. It's not that I'm lazy. It's that I want some way to participate in society. And I feel like life hasn't given me a shot. What does that look like if what you're competing with is a computer that can do endlessly better than you? Right. You don't have the intellectual capacity to do programming or administrators because they're necessarily getting screened the creamiest of the crop for those jobs. I'm worried about what that society looks like. And what does that turn into? How long does that last? Because at a certain point, I'm worried that bifurcation, that extreme inequality could get very ugly culturally and bloody and all sorts of other things.
Well, see, that's what I mean with, it's one of those things we need to be able to accommodate. I mean, and that's a person thing. That's not a technology thing. I mean, honestly, I don't want a person dropping french fries. I don't want that. If we could help it, I don't necessarily want a person behind the wheel of a car for 20 hours to get from point A to point B, especially if you can have a robot to just do it easier without getting sleepy and tired and everything else. I honestly do believe that technology, automation, intelligence, all of that stuff is there to make life on some level easier. The catch is, I don't think there's a situation where I think people are always going to have some level of work to do, even if it's soft jobs, if that makes sense. But, you got a point. Not everybody wants to do a soft job. And not everybody can be a software engineer. And not everybody can do X or Y. And it's something we're going to have to accommodate.
Now add in intelligence amplification. Well,
what's intelligence amplification?
Add in the Neuralink thing. We have our guest on the line, and I don't want to delay it at all.
Okay.
Let's take it into a break.
Yes.
You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be coming back with our next guest, Stephen Donziger, American attorney, The victim of Chevron, I would argue strongly.
Yeah.
We've spoken with him once before. We're very, very happy to have him back on. We're going to be getting into the conversation with him about his case and also recent news having to do with Exxon. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Hi, I'm political analyst Garland Nixon.
And I'm political scientist, author, and nationally syndicated columnist Dr. Wilmer Leon.
We're the co-hosts for The Critical Hour, airing Monday through Friday from 6 to 8 p.m. Eastern Time here on Radio Sputnik in Washington, D.C.
We close out your day with a thorough and hard-hitting analysis of the day's top stories where we bring in brilliant scholars, authors, and investigative journalists from around the world.
And on Fridays, it's panel time when we do a roundup of the week's most important issues.
Join us to keep up with the world's top stories.
Enjoy an in-depth analysis.
And have a little fun along the way. Listen to our show.
The Critical Hour, Monday through Fridays on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined with my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join into the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. But without a veil, let's get to our next guest. So, Stephen Donziger. This has been someone who people have called into the show, Tarif, famously, always says free Donziger. This boils down to a $9 billion settlement that was lost by Chevron. Stephen won. And from this point, you would think that this would be a celebratory thing where the people of Ecuador, who cancer rates and everything else that have been increasing, illness were increasing because of dumping and the toxic waste, that this would be a triumphant opportunity. But that's not how this ended up. Chevron uses its connections in the United States to basically go after Donziger. Everything from house arrests, everything from having a judge filed almost like a RICO case against him, using a private company or a private law firm to go after him when the federal government decided to not prosecute the case. I'm going to let him explain the elements that are going on. There's a trial that's supposed to come up on October the 1st dealing with sentencing, and we wanted to bring him back to have a conversation on the latest on his particular case and the expectations going forward. So the voice that you guys are about to hear is Stephen Donziger. He's an American attorney who specializes in creating legal strategies and advocacy campaigns to address corporate malfeasance and human rights abuses. Donziger represented over 30,000 farmers and indigenous people from Ecuador in a case against Chevron related to the environmental damage and health effects. Stephen, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. So this centers around this kind of landmark verdict in 2011 for the $9.5 billion damages to the people in Ecuador who have basically illness, cancers from dumping and toxic waste that they were basically dumping into the surrounding areas. After this, what goes on? Because of some extremely disturbing events start to take place once Chevron brings the case back into the United States and argues that there was some level of fraud or some level of bribery, even bringing in a judge that eventually recanted his statements, but basically to make misstatements against you in order to back up this particular case. Please take it from there. First, did I say anything in this wrong? And please take it from there.
Well, thank you for having me. First of all, my name is pronounced Donziger. Minor little issue. Don't want to get hung up on that. Fundamentally, this is the story in a couple of minutes. I work with a team of lawyers down in Ecuador to sue Chevron for dumping billions of gallons of cancer-causing waste onto indigenous ancestral lands in the Amazon rainforest. We had an 8-year trial. Chevron accepted jurisdiction. The result of the trial was that Chevron lost. The company was found guilty of engaging in these horrific practices that led to death, destruction, and the decimation of indigenous cultures. The courts in Ecuador affirmed a $9.5 billion damages judgment against Chevron. It was affirmed by Ecuador's highest court, its Supreme Court. It was affirmed also by multiple appellate courts in Canada, where the affected communities went to enforce their judgment. Chevron refused to pay. Instead, they came back to U.S. courts, sued me and other lawyers personally for billions of dollars, claiming the case in Ecuador was a fraud. Chevron's theory was bogus. It was based completely, or I should say largely, on a witness to whom they paid millions of dollars, flew him up from Ecuador, who claimed that I had bribed a judge, but there was no evidence that this happened. It did not happen. It's not true. They then engineered the case to a pro-corporate judge here in New York, Lewis Kaplan, who is a former tobacco industry defense lawyer. He denied me a jury and credited the testimony, the false testimony of this paid witness. Witness Alberto Guerra later admitted he had lied before Kaplan. Nevertheless, Kaplan found, again without a jury in a civil case, that I had bribed the judge in Ecuador. And on that basis, he barred me from trying to enforce the Ecuador judgment in U.S. courts. Because again, Chevron would not pay. He also imposed millions of dollars of fines on me. I'm a human rights lawyer. I live modestly with my wife and son in New York City in a small apartment. I couldn't pay the fines, and on that basis, Chevron got him to issue an order that I turn over my computer to Chevron. And on the theory that somewhere in my computer was evidence I was hiding money that I could use to pay Chevron. Chevron literally spent millions of dollars in legal fees to try to get my computer. It's illegal under the law, in my view, to force an attorney to turn over his computer and cell phone.
Well, attorney-client privilege, basically.
Obviously, yes. So this is all privileged information. So I appealed that order, Judge Kaplan's order. While the appeal of his order was pending, he charged me with criminal contempt of court for not complying with the order that I was appealing, and had me locked up in my home, where I've now been for 772 days, 2 years, 2 months, on a misdemeanor, where the maximum sentence is 90 days. 6 months in prison, but the maximum sentence ever imposed on a lawyer convicted of my level of offense is 90 days of home confinement. And I've already done 9 times that amount. So on top of this, and this is really where it goes crazy, in my view, is when Judge Kaplan charged me with criminal contempt, his charges were rejected by the SDNY, that is the federal prosecutor in Manhattan. So Kaplan then appointed a private law firm to prosecute me in the name of the public, paid by taxpayers. This law firm, the name of which is Seward and Kissel, later disclosed that Chevron was a client and that it has major clients in the oil and gas industry aside from Chevron. Furthermore, Kaplan appointed the judge. Always in criminal cases in New York and other districts, they're assigned randomly. Kaplan appointed the judge, who ended up being a close colleague, who's a leader of the Federalist Society, which, as most people know, is a pro-business legal organization. Her name is Loretta Preska. She's the one who had me locked up pre-trial on this misdemeanor, the first time in U.S. history a lawyer's ever been locked up on a contempt charge pre-trial. She also has ties to Chevron because Chevron is a major funder of the Federalist Society, where she's a leader and a very public figure in that organization. So essentially, this is the nation's first corporate prosecution. I'm being prosecuted by a Chevron law firm in the name of the public, having my liberty deprived by a Chevron law firm and a Chevron-linked judge. And this is very dangerous to the fabric of our society in the United States. I believe it violates the rule of law. Totally inappropriate. First time it's ever happened that is a corporation prosecuting someone. But trust me when I say this, this is a new playbook by the fossil fuel industry in particular to go after activists who are just a little bit too successful in holding them accountable for major acts of pollution and the destruction of the planet. What Chevron did down in Ecuador is outrageous. It was not the oil problem in the Amazon was not an accident. It was done by deliberate design to dump as a way to save money. And it's produced decades and decades of suffering of thousands and thousands of people, many of whom have died of cancer and other oil-related diseases. So, I think they're going after me because what our team has done to hold Chevron accountable is very, very threatening to the industry, to the fossil fuel industry, and just to the power of the oil industry to sort of get what it wants in an era of structural decline. So I'll stop there. I don't know if you have any questions.
That was a great overview, and naturally we do, and we're glad to have you on again, Mr. Donziger. A couple of things. The Southern District of New York, I suppose, is naturally where this case would be held, but they're also notoriously corrupt. Now, this, as pushing the boundaries, is pushing that corruption to another level. You mentioned a playbook here that is being used on you for the first time, but of course the point of writing up a playbook is to use it again. Can you just spell out for people who are doing similar work to you, looking to do that kind of work, what does that playbook look like? You've just gone over it in detail, but in a sort of broader sense. What should other people, speaking to people who are looking to follow in your path, what specifically, what advice would you give them? That's kind of where I'm going with this. What specifically was done to you? And if you had to speak to somebody else who's trying to do similar things to you, what would you tell them to give them the best chance of success, knowing what you know now, Mr. Donziger?
No, thank you for your question. I mean, look, the playbook essentially consists of weaponizing the law and the legal system, against activists such that they get silenced and their advocacy simply can't be effective. And it's very harrowing for any individual to be sued by an oil company, even if the oil company has no valid legal basis to the lawsuit. Just by bringing it and getting it going, it can bankrupt an activist or a lawyer or any kind of defendant. And the oil industry knows this, so their playbook is to go after and sue people who challenge them. And the idea is the very fact of the lawsuit is usually enough to get people to abandon their advocacy. In my case, because we had won a major judgment, and we have enough of a legal team to keep it going on behalf of the indigenous peoples of Ecuador, they then have gone further and tried to lock me up in ways that we've never seen before. But I think that's largely because this case has gone such a great distance towards success that they had to sort of really go after us by having this unprecedented corporate prosecution. When I say the SDNY rejected the case, that's very important. They looked at these charges against me and said, we're not prosecuting. And by the way, this is the third time that they've rejected efforts by Chevron's lawyers to get me criminally prosecuted. But, the playbook, again, is to use the law to attack activists and to try to criminalize advocacy. In other words, in my situation, Chevron committed environmental crimes. They were found by a court to have dumped billions of gallons of cancer-causing waste into the environment. And the people who made those decisions have obtained effective impunity, while the lawyer who played a leading role in holding them accountable has been locked up for 2 years. So that's the playbook. We as citizens need to be aware of it and not let them get away with it in my case.
It is very disturbing that a judge would appoint a private firm that's connected to Chevron to basically prosecute you, for lack of a better term for it. And this is similar to some kind of RICO statute, if I'm reading this correctly?
So the RICO statute, which was passed by the U.S. Congress to target the mafia decades ago, has been twisted and turned on its head by Chevron in this case and other fossil fuel companies like Enbridge and others that are engaged with activists right now to really try to criminalize advocacy. The way that happens is, the RICO statute targets racketeering. So the corporations have figured out that if they can portray any advocacy campaign to hold them accountable as some sort of racketeering effort, they can then use the RICO statute to create sort of hell on earth for advocates. So the RICO statute is being completely abused, and again, intended to target the mafia, is now being used to target environmental activists claiming that they are engaging in mafia-like activities just by engaging in normal advocacy.
This is uber bizarre. As I'm looking at the case and I'm looking at the various people who were put into it, be it the judge, first judge, second judge, and the law firm itself, there is no way to extricate yourself from this line of judges? Like, I guess what I'm asking is there some kind of legal way out of being under direct control of this particular judge or any of these people, considering their ties to the company itself?
Well, other judges have to rule that the judge needs to get off the case, and that unfortunately has not happened yet. The judges on the appellate court are allowing this Chevron law firm to conduct a criminal prosecution that was rejected by the regular federal prosecutor. So, at this point, the composition of the federal bench, especially after the Trump administration, has really turned so far to the right that it's very difficult to get judges on an appellate panel to go against what I'm facing, unfortunately. That said, I believe that we will continue to fight, and as more and more people become aware of this really completely inappropriate corporate prosecution, they will speak out and act. We've had many members of Congress now demand Merrick Garland act to stop this corporate prosecution as a violation of the rule of law. Merrick Garland has not acted, but we're going to keep pushing it, and ultimately I hope to prevail.
I said something earlier, Mr. Donziger. I said that the SDNY is notoriously corrupt. That's what I've heard. And I want to check with you to see if you agree with that. But also, it seems to me to be characteristic of a lot of problems in the American judicial system. Loretta Preska is a big judge. You look her up. She's not a little-known judge. She's been around for a while. And certainly, her colleagues, the people with whom she's working in that district, don't want to get on her wrong side, so to speak. It's a sort of tacit letting things happen that I think leads to, worsening corruption over time. And I think you can see that in this case. But were you surprised by this, or were you aware going into it that it could be this bad?
Well, I have seen a lot over the last 10 years as Chevron has attacked me that has surprised me. I think our judicial system is in a state of disrepair to some degree to let this kind of thing happen, to let it go so far, to have a human rights lawyer locked up in the United States of America in his home for over 2 years of a misdemeanor. I mean, it's unprecedented. It's unheard of. There's never been a lawyer locked up for even a day on this level of offense. And I've been locked up now, as I said, for over 770 days. So there's some real irregularities here. And, I believe Judge Preska, Judge Kaplan, who charged me, are abusing their power. I'm fighting through the courts to hold them accountable and to get myself vindicated and out of this situation where I wear an ankle bracelet 24/7. You know, I am not really prepared to comment on much of anything other than what's happened to me in this particular case, but I just think that what's happened to me really has to be stopped if we are to preserve the rule of law in this pocket of our country where I live. So I'm very much hoping that the judges on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the appellate court, federal appellate court here in New York that oversees Judge Preska, will look at this situation and take it seriously and take action.
Speaking about her taking it seriously and taking action, I'm looking that you have sentencing is going to be October 1st. The person who's going to be doing the sentencing apparently was reading newspapers at your trial while you were basically facing prison time. Correct? Meaning this is the judge that is supposed to preside over this particular case. That is uncommon, to put it mildly, correct?
The judge who's going to sentence me is Judge Preska. You know, she's the judge that Judge Kaplan appointed to oversee the case. She denied me a jury. She barred me from testifying on my own defense as to my reasons for not turning over my computer and cell phone. And now she's, you know, she locked me up, obviously, for over 2 years pre-trial, unprecedented, totally unnecessary, and I think orchestrated really to punish me for my successful work against Chevron. And now she's going to sentence me on top of my 2 years of home detention on a misdemeanor. She's going to sentence me potentially to 6 months in jail on October 1st. So for those who live in New York, we're asking people to come to court that day. It's 500 Pearl Street, Federal Courthouse in Manhattan at 8:30 in the morning. There's going to be a rally in support of me and in support of the people of Ecuador. And then we're going to ask everyone to come into court and in support of me and the people of Ecuador and bear witness to what's going to go down.
That's 500 Pearl Street, 8:30 in the morning on October 1st, right?
That's exactly right. And if you follow me on Twitter at @Donziger, you'll get a lot of this information, a lot of case updates. I tweet a couple times a day, 2, 3, 4 times a day about things that are going on. It's quite interesting. And we're asking people to come down and support that day. It's very important that the judges, Judge Preska, see that I am a man who does have support and people of Ecuador have support. And, you know, we need some degree of accountability over what's happening to the extent we can generate it.
You know, I'm curious, are you concerned in giving interviews like this that the judge will be punitive? I mean, granted, it seems they've been punitive up to this point already to some obscene degree. But does that concern you? Is that something that's in the back of your mind? For that matter, what do you think is going to take place on October 1st?
I don't know. We're going to go in good faith and ask her to release me, given the amount of time I've served already at home, which, again, is 9 times longer than the longest sentence ever imposed on a lawyer. You know, I think Judge Preska has her agenda. Unfortunately for me and the people of Ecuador, I think it deviates from her ethical duties to be fair, to be neutral. But, you know, we're going to go in and defend my rights and appeal the case. I think she will try to put me in jail. And if she does, that will be the sentence, and we will appeal it. So we'll see how it plays out. I'm hoping she will do what we think would be the more fair thing and release me that day so I can come home without an ankle bracelet and continue my life and try to earn a living and go back to my human rights advocacy work. But, you know, the whole point of this exercise is, you know, to silence me. And, you know, we'll see how it plays out on October 1st. But, you know, of course, I take everything into account when I speak publicly, but I think it's very, very important that the world learn about this and understand what's happening, because it goes well, well beyond me. It affects every advocate in the United States and beyond. You know, if courts can do this to advocates, lock them up for being successful, particularly against the fossil fuel industry in a time of global warming, you know, we're all going to suffer for it, and our society will suffer for it. So I think it's very important that people learn about this, and that's why I'm more than happy to give interviews to give my story and to tell what I believe to be the truth.
The sickening irony about what you're going into here is that in some sense it will be a sweet relief and release if you're able to, if they go ahead with the sentencing, everything goes according to normal, even assuming that of course it's guilty, you're, like you said, you're able to get out of it. The punishment that they've already been able to exact upon you, with the constant basically suppression. You can't talk, you can only talk within certain confines. And of course, I understand that you're talking within them now because there's an ongoing court case. That's thing one. Thing two, you're stuck in your house. House arrest for over 2 years is a long time to be in house arrest. And people, I don't mean to be too lighthearted about this. People have suffered, whatever COVID did to people, it's not as long as what you've had to deal with in your case. But maybe I'm putting this wrong. Is there, it seems to me, because it would be in some sense good for you to go through this process, to get out, like you're saying, to be able to resume your advocacy on the other side, is there anything they can do to delay it, to slow it down? Is there a concern going into October 1st that that's going to happen, or is it simply sentencing done? I just don't know the legal proceedings well enough to understand it, but hopefully you understand my question. In other words, can they drag this out any longer, or is October 1st effectively going to be the bookend at the end of this long process?
Well, it will go further because there will be an appeal of the conviction that's leading to the sentencing on October 1st, and that's going to take 1 to 2 years. It's possible Judge Prescott will keep me in the same situation under home arrest that entire period of time. She has the right. It's possible she will sentence me to a prison term. I don't know what she's going to do. I'll find out October 1st. But whatever it is, we're going to tell our story that day. We're going to fight. If she does not release me, again, we have an appeal. And we'll see ultimately how it turns out. I just refuse to surrender to the notion that corporate prosecutions can actually happen in the United States. This is the first one. And we're going to challenge it. And I'm moderately confident judges somewhere along the line on the appellate courts will also agree with us. Even pro-corporate judges, we've talked to, many pro-corporate lawyers are highly offended by what's happening to me. It's scary. It's scary for society that purports to be a rule of law society. It's scary for everybody. No one wants to be targeted by a private company law firm in a criminal prosecution without a jury, no less. So, there's so many anomalies here, but this is not going to end October 1st. That's just going to be another new pivot point, I think, that ultimately, I hope, will lead to my vindication and, of course, a remedy for the thousands of people in Ecuador who continue to suffer the effects of Chevron's pollution.
And that is ultimately what this is about. A couple of quick, sort of point of fact here. The house arrest, I'm guessing they're doing this in the way, I'm going to bring in another case here. Julian Assange, of course, they've had him in captivity for a long time. His captivity has had a serious chilling effect on journalism. It's a sort of iceberg that we don't know what would have been published if people hadn't been steered away from doing good work by seeing what happened to him, although hopefully that wouldn't actually steer the good people from doing their good work. Anyway, that's in the sphere of media and journalism. Yours is in the sphere of the law and, like you were saying, attorneys working on important cases like this. But were they putting you in house arrest? What was the justification for that? Was it that they a simple flight risk? What was it?
The ostensible justification that I was a risk of flight, that I was going to flee to Ecuador, which, it's preposterous.
Yeah.
You know it, but that was the legal justification. I've been to Ecuador over 200 times for the case over 20 years, living in New York, but it's just ridiculous that I would flee the country to go live in Ecuador to avoid a misdemeanor.
Seriously.
And I lived here in New York for, 25 years. I'm married with my wife and son, who abandoned my life. I just don't, that's not how I function. And anyone who's watched me litigate this case now for 28 years, I never not show up. This is what I do. So that was all a pretext, a legal pretext to keep me locked up, that there was some risk of flight. I'll note that they took my passport, so I can't travel. And they also impose an $800,000 bond on me, again, for a misdemeanor. I mean, my bond alone, putting aside the house arrest, is higher than 3 of the 4 cops who murdered George Floyd. You can believe it. So this is all part of the effort to criminalize. You know, if you lock a guy up and impose a high bond, and people look at it, they assume I must have done something really, really wrong.
Yep.
And that's how the fossil fuel industry uses courts to try to demonize and criminalize their advocates. And that's exactly what Chevron has been trying to do to me for 10 years. And they've 3 times gone to the SDNY to get me criminally prosecuted. And when the SDNY would not prosecute me, they just figured out a way to prosecute me directly in the name of the SDNY. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
And the chilling effect we've been talking about, but there's another side of this that I want to get your take on in the time we have left, Mr. Donziger, and thank you again for sticking with us. Great conversation. What I can imagine going through Chevron execs' minds or through lawyers consulting with them, whatever, they lost this case in Ecuador. But if they can have it be the case that, the guy who was pushing that case was put in prison in the United States and was in captivity for, for years, and effectively, if they can paint you as guilty, then they can kind of undo the PR hit they receive whenever it's covered by the story in Ecuador. Do you see that? What's your take on that?
This is exactly their strategy. I mean, they want to distract attention from the fact they were found guilty by 6 different appellate courts in Ecuador and Canada, including the Supreme Courts, by the way, of both countries, of the deliberate dumping of, billions of gallons of cancer-causing toxic oil waste into the Amazon, waste that has killed probably thousands of people. We don't know the precise number because, they've never funded a health study. But based on anecdotal evidence and some other data, many, many people have died. And they don't want people thinking about that. They want people thinking about Steve Donziger, So they concocted this narrative to make me the face of something bad as a way to get people not to think about the ecocide and the massive environmental crimes they visited upon the Amazon. So that is their strategy. And again, they're weaponizing the courts of the United States with the cooperation of these 2 federal judges, Louis Kaplan and Loretta Preska, to carry it out. It's a demonization strategy. We have an email from 2009 where they admit it. A Chevron official says to other Chevron officials in an email, our long-term strategy is to demonize Donziger. This is that. This is what's happening. It's been happening for 10 years. At the beginning, under the racketeering case they brought against me, I was sued for $60 billion. Think about that. Not million, billion.
Yeah.
That's the largest amount of money any individual in the United States has ever been sued for. And I'm just a human rights lawyer working out of my kitchen.
That is insane.
It is insane. It just seems so wild to me that a judge, the government of the United States, who ostensibly has the responsibility of either handling prosecutions or whatever, says we're not going to do it, and the judge appoints a private company to do so. That is astonishing to me.
That's the new playbook. People need to be really careful here and understand what's happening, pay attention. By the way, I have a website if you want to learn more about it called donziger.com, and there's a bunch of articles on there, and you can donate to my legal defense fund. I need support to deal with this monster to the extent you can help. That would be great. But sign up anyway, freedonziger.com, and you'll get regular updates about the case. Even if you can't give money, just get involved in our campaign. But I just want to say that, what part of Chevron's strategy is they want people to listen to me now in interviews like this and be demoralized. Oh, my God, I can't do that work. This is crazy. This is too scary. And I understand if you feel that way. But I want to emphasize before we have to sign off here that the Ecuadorian communities, with my help and the help of other lawyers, won the case. This is happening to me because we won, not because we lost did anything wrong. And you can win these cases. And even though right now I am in a complicated situation personally, the larger case is really good. There's other lawyers in other countries who are working on enforcing the judgment against Chevron. And I'm optimistic that at some point I'll get through this and be able to get back to what I really want to do, which is my human rights work. But, if this is a price that must be paid for people to become more aware of this playbook and the danger of private corporate criminal prosecutions, we can get benefit out of this, even though I am personally having to endure a major ordeal, me and my family, my wife and son, by me being locked up now for over 2 years in my home. So I just want to emphasize, be optimistic. The work can be done. The attacks on me are a sign of our success, a sign of our effectiveness, a sign that Chevron's scared, feels risked. And that's what's called accountability. That's how accountability works. You're succeeding when they take actions that are so extreme and so nakedly corrupt and other people can see them and they do it anyway. They're really scared. And the final chapters of this really epic battle are still to be written. And it's very unclear how it's going to turn out. But, I don't feel defeated. I mean, I feel like I'm dealing with a heavy load right now. But we have won the case, and I want to emphasize that.
Absolutely. Stephen Donziger, thank you so much for joining us. For folks who want to support him, go to freedonziger.com. Also, his sentencing October 1st, like he was saying earlier, if you want to go out and support him, if you're in the area or if you want to head to the area, that's going to be at 500 Pearl Street. It's going to be taking place at 8:30 a.m. Eastern in the morning on October 1st.
In Manhattan.
In Manhattan. Thank you. We were joined by Stephen Donziger. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us. Great conversation. Really appreciate you taking, over half an hour to speak with us.
Thank you so much. Appreciate the opportunity. Have a good day.
Hey, you too. Stephen Donziger is an American attorney whose case you just heard. Extremely compelling story. And at the end there, you can hear his altruism, and it is genuine. He's a good man, from what I can tell. American attorney who specializes in creating legal strategies and advocacy campaigns to address corporate malfeasance and human rights abuses. Donziger represented over 30,000 farmers and indigenous people from Ecuador in a case against Chevron related to environmental damage and health effects. We're going into our break now. When we come back, we'll be taking calls briefly for about 5-6 minutes here. 202-521-1320 is the phone number. I want to talk about these 10,000 migrants under a bridge in Houston. Story coming out last night. This morning, Ted Cruz is on the scene. We'll be getting into it. Anyway, we're taking your calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I see people in the chat donating to Stephen Donziger's defense fund already. There we go. Good job. We're taking your calls. 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 is the phone number for this station. I wanted to turn to, like I mentioned before the break, the 10,000 plus Haitian migrants under a bridge. Had you seen this morning, Jamarl?
Yeah.
I'd first seen it. I was walking out there, and it is on Good Morning America. They're covering it.
Mm-hmm.
And it is a big story. Ted Cruz, of course, blaming the Biden administration for encouraging migrants to come to the U.S. Many would blame Ted Cruz for not taking those migrants in once they've arrived in Texas, but that's just the dynamic here. What do you think?
I don't know. I don't entirely know enough about the story. I just came across the story, I think it was this morning, just looking through some of the news items. But right here, thousands of migrants huddle in squalid conditions under Texas bridge. What is this called? The Del Rio International Bridge. As agents worked as quickly as they could to process the migrants. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, clearly it's not great. that you have this many people in these kind of conditions or these squalor conditions.
And why are they under the bridge? Because it's over 100 degrees there, because it's triple-digit heat that they're forced to live in, sleep in, that kind of thing, at least for this short period of time. How long is this going to last? And is this going to spark any reanalysis of the migrant crisis, or the immigration crisis, the border crisis, different ways of putting it? Is this going to bring that back into the conversation and make that a big thing, which, on the one hand would be useful, but on the other hand would probably distract from Afghanistan, which we should still be covering in our press. There's a big, big deal. I'm kind of going all over the place here, but I think you got my question. What's this going to do in the media? Where do you see this going?
Well, I mean, the last time around with the migrant crisis, I mean, the media did pay attention to it. I mean, they kept asking Kamala Harris, are you going to the border? Are you going to the border? This one is a little bit different, though. I mean, these are, Haitian migrants, apparently. And like you said, the conditions are tremendously bad at this point. 9,000, basically, the majority of which are from Haiti. And so it's not exactly the same as it was in the South, but it's still migrants, and it's still this kind of processing of people in horrible conditions.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it should drag it into the public sphere. I mean, this is the New York Times that's covering it. Yeah, it's just unfortunate. Look, we have issues in this country in regards to immigration. And it seems to be one of those things we kick down the, it's like we just keep kicking the can. And even at some points, it looks like it's being used as a political football, let's say by Democrats or something like that. Like, hey, if you don't vote this person in, this is going to happen to you when the other guy comes in, that type of stuff. But this is a little bit different. I mean, Haitian migrants and everything else, not to mention, we were talking about the story in Haiti anyway, where they just had the president basically killed by various people.
We don't know who they is at this point.
The question mark of they. All of this is strange and odd, but clearly not good.
Yes. We have a caller. Tarif, calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, thanks for the call. What's on your mind, man?
Thanks for taking my call. First, I'd like to say free journal signs, free Donziger, and hands off heat. I'm glad you had Donziger on again.
Donziger.
It's the first comment. Oh,
Donziger. Yeah, Donziger. He corrected us, and so I'm going to pass it down.
Yeah. Hey, thank you. Sometimes I mispronounce names, but Scott Ritter came out with a tweet yesterday saying that the person Dumb going after was connected to the fake story of the DC the DNC hack, Suman or something.
Michael Sussman. Yep. Right. We were talking about this earlier at 7:30.
So that's good. We'll find out maybe that person can spill the beans about what's going on.
Well, that's the question, right? I mean, how far does this rabbit hole go? And, despite the fact that the investigation was supposed to be against FBI, CIA, whatever, intelligence services, and how they were going after Donald Trump. I mean, this is basically a person. And this particular person seems to have lied and not even disclosing that they were working for the Clinton Foundation. Daniel Lazar made the point that he was pretty much at the center of this whole Russia-Trump stuff. And so, it seems like a solid case. I guess the catch becomes, what about the other elements? Because it didn't necessarily seem like this was an individual process. I mean, it seems like it was potentially agency-wide. But got to start somewhere, I suppose.
Arif, we're almost out of time, but any last thoughts here?
Yeah, just one more thought. Trump came out with a tweet yesterday on Instagram saying Milley never told him about the car made in China, and he never told anybody else, which put the country in danger. But he also said President Xi knows better and would have called him about, with the statement that came out in his book and stuff like that. Basically, calling General Milley a liar and saying that, he's a nut job. And
okay, he says, she says at this point. I don't necessarily buy that Xi Jinping would have called Trump, but I also don't know that Li Zhicheng, I think was the name of the Chinese general. I don't know that he would have, I don't know. I don't know any of this stuff, Tarif. I can only speculate so far. I only know what I know. Tarif from New Orleans, thank you for the call. We're closing this hour out. We'll be back in a minute with headlines and the last hour of this morning show. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for the last hour this morning and this week of the most disruptive show, covering news, politics, and events from across these disunited states of America and the increasingly disunited, embattled, fiery surface of our globe. Need a new set of adjectives. In the independent corner, I'm your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am your indefatigable, your ever-vigilant, last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, good morning again, folks. It's Friday, September 17th. It's 9:01 a.m. Eastern, and we're getting into headlines. First up, in COVID news, to give you the stats, there were about 155,000 new COVID cases reported in the United States yesterday. There were 3,415 deaths reported, too. Over the past week, there have been an average of about 150,366 cases per day. That's a decrease of 9% from the average taken 2 weeks earlier. 54% of the total American public has been fully vaccinated. 63% of residents have received at least one dose. As of this morning, the coronavirus has infected 41,790,700 people across the United States. It has killed 670,231 of us in America. Today, the FDA's Independent Advisory Committee will convene to debate the Pfizer booster shots. They will be discussing if the booster is safe enough for widespread use and whether it's necessary and effective in improving protection levels against COVID-19. The vote there is going to be non-binding, but the FDA generally follows the advice of the board, so semi-binding. Tacitly binding or something like that. After Angela Underwood's husband went into the ICU for COVID-19, she demanded they use ivermectin to treat him. The staff refused, and Underwood took them to court. Underwood, being a registered nurse, believed it was a good option for emergency use in this case. The judge, however, delivered a scathing resolution denying her claim, calling out people who have promoted and supported the deworming drug as an effective treatment for battling COVID-19. In national news, tomorrow Washington, D.C. will serve as the site for the quote-unquote Justice for J6 rally, which will take place outside of the Capitol. The rally is intended to serve as a defense for those who are being charged in connection to the breach of the Capitol on January 6th. Fencing that had been installed following January 6th has been reinstalled in advance of tomorrow's rally. The word, however, is that far-right and right-wing groups have warned against attending the rally. Attorney Michael Sussman has been indicted for allegedly lying to the FBI regarding the disproven Trump-Russia probe. Sussman faces one count of false statements in his conversation with the FBI, where he discussed possible ties between Russian lender Alpha Bank and a computer server at the Trump organization. More than 10,000 migrants are gathered and fenced off under a bridge in Del Rio, Texas, as authorities attempt to process everyone. The people are sleeping on the dirt or trying to stay cool in the triple-digit heat. Ted Cruz and other Republicans are calling this a, quote, man-made disaster caused by Joe Biden, end quote. That's a direct quote from Ted Cruz, but other Republicans can imagine it.
Yeah.
And, well, you know, I'll put it like this. Ted Cruz got the optics of this situation pitch perfect. He showed up at the scene doing live reporting on Twitter, just streaming, as he did in the, southern border before, where he showed up kind of, you remember this.
And it looks bad. I mean, I was looking at the number of people here, and yeah, triple-degree heat. This is southern border, so we're talking about like in Texas and around surrounding areas.
Well, it's right on the Texas-Mexico border.
Yeah, and most of these guys are Haitian immigrants.
Yep.
Yeah, this does not look good. I mean, at this point, sanitation has to be an issue. Where they're going to sleep, where they're going to stay. And apparently they're saying they're trying to get either immigration to go and help with the number of people who are there. Because at this point, 9,000 people basically in one small area just seems,
That's bad.
Yeah.
A bunch of ways.
Yeah.
A cave in Missouri full of 1,000-year-old, wait, I skipped one. A viral TikTok trend known as Devious Licks is hitting school districts all across the country. The trend has kids stealing random things from their schools and then posting the results to the app. That's TikTok. What started as mouse pads and soap dispensers has turned into urinals, projectors, whiteboards, even a school bus, all stolen by students. Did they I'm just trying to think about how this goes. Did they hijack it? It's too soon after September 11th. for me to be making hijacking jokes.
You mean the bus?
They just stole it. They just had a key. They just put the key into the ignition and they drove the bus away. I'm just liking the idea of like kids.
Oh, did they hotwire it, or did they just get the key somehow?
No, what I imagined was like they're on their way to school and a bunch of kids like rush the front, overpower the bus driver.
Oh, geez, I hope that's not it.
It's
At that point, that's a violent crime.
It is a violent crime.
I took it as they either stole the key, hotwired it, or somehow and just took off on a joyride.
My sense of dark humor has not come across. That's all that was. And then I realized halfway through, wait, September 11th, I'm a doofus. A cave in Missouri full of 1,000-year-old indigenous artwork was just sold for $2.2 million in an auction. That's a direct slap in the face for the Osage Nation, who hoped to buy the land in order to protect and preserve the sacred site of their ancestors. The cave was the site of sacred rituals and burials. It also has more than 290 prehistoric glyphs, making it the largest collection of indigenous peoples' polychrome paintings in Missouri. Glyphs, by the way, are hieroglyphic symbols, basically hieroglyphs, you can think of them like that, used to represent sounds or meanings. Kind of reminds me of runes, like in old Norse writing, runes. Same idea, broadly. Anyway, in international news, the French government has canceled a meeting with the United States following the passage of a defense deal with Australia, which cut France out of a lucrative $90 billion contract to sell Australia submarines. France's foreign minister had earlier called the move the quote-unquote deal of the century. The Assent said this is a stab in the back by the American government. The United States announced the deal on Wednesday. It will sell Australia nuclear-powered submarines in a partnership which includes the United Kingdom. South Africa's former president, Jacob Zuma, lost his bid to overturn his 15-month jail sentence for contempt of court after failing to appear at a corruption inquiry. He had argued that the sentence was excessive, saying it endangered his health. Zuma is 79 years old. Allies of Alexei Navalny are responding negatively to a decision by Google and Apple to remove a voting app from their app stores as Russia enters parliamentary elections, with some alleging that the tech giants are siding with Putin against the Russian people. A source in Google said it removed the app in response to legal demands from Russian authorities. A court in Vienna is now hearing a case against the Austrian government. The case was brought by the family of a man who died last year at a ski resort that spread the coronavirus across the country. The family is arguing that the Austrian government did not do enough to curtail the spread of the virus. The China and Russia-led Shanghai Cooperation Organization have endorsed Iran's future membership of the bloc, adding to South Asian rivals India and Pakistan. The move further asserts China and Russia as key players in the Middle East, as the U.S. exit from Afghanistan has allowed other countries to invest more heavily in the region. In tech news, Lucid Air's electric sedan challenges Tesla with a final range rating of 520 miles on a full charge. The Tesla Model S long range only boasts 405 miles in its range. Tesla is working on other things, however, like their freight semi-truck coming in 2022. The truck will reach 0 to 60 miles per hour in 20 seconds with a full 80,000 pounds load. For contrast, it takes a modern diesel truck nearly 5 minutes to hit this speed. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. I've said this before, and I'll say it again because for some reason I was thinking about it last night. The Cybertruck, the kind of it was embarrassing. A lot of people remember the Cybertruck because
when ugly truck. Yeah,
what'd you say?
I remember that. It was ugly.
You said ugly.
I thought it was butt ugly. The Cybertruck?
I love it. It's not ugly.
Really? You like it?
Spare the arrow you just sent into my heart. I think it's adorable. I think it's hard angularity. Well, it looks a little bit uncomfortable, but on the inside, I'm sure it's comfy. And I just, here's I'm going to be honest.
That's Tesla's thing, right? That was his, I remember that.
And I say embarrassing. The reason I didn't even get into it, it was embarrassing because when he demoed the truck, when he first debuted it on the stage, they were talking, they were really playing it up. Oh, this is a super strong car. It's like, you can take this into the cyberpunk apocalypse, and gunfire coming at you from the sides of the streets. They're playing to the worst in us or something like that. Anyway, he put it up on the stage, and then they get I forget exactly what it was. It wasn't a bowling ball. It was like a shot put ball, something like that, like a thick metallic ball that Elon Musk had in his hand. And in order to show that it could resist the ball, he threw it at the windshield.
It broke.
But it broke. Yeah. Now, it didn't shatter. It just broke, sort of like you might imagine an iPhone screen doing or something like that, where it gets cracked and indented. It doesn't shatter. He did it multiple times. It kept shattering it. It was a little bit embarrassing. I think technically he did prove his point, which is it doesn't break. If for some reason somebody were to throw a shot put ball at your car as your car is speeding towards them, you would probably be spared the shot put ball entering through the windshield, which is a success in my opinion, but people were like, oh man, that's kind of embarrassing. Anyway, I'm into it. I know we have other headlines.
I wasn't a big fan of the car, but hey, to each his own.
Here's why I'm into it. It has this massive battery. The more expensive versions also have this massive battery, and I was thinking, Like, I'm into the idea of, like, potentially car camping. I've talked about, like, van life or whatever. You build up a van, relatively cheap, and you can live in it. I'm not saying right now.
Driving through Egypt or something like that, stopping at the various locations and sleeping in the van. Yeah, I met a couple that was doing that. There was, like, in Dahab, Cairo. They were literally going all the way up the coast.
It is brave.
Yeah.
That's a very cool way to do it. I know people people do it all around the world. It's kind of become an Instagram thing. But the idea with a Cybertruck is you have an in-car battery that, like, you don't want to drain it completely down, but, like, you could use that to charge your phones. It's just electric cars give you unique abilities that, gas-powered vehicles don't.
Yeah.
I just feel like it would be cool, and you could sleep in the back of it and stuff. I just imagine, like, a Cybertruck van conversion thing for living in, but maybe I'm a nerd who's into the tech dystopia thing too much.
I don't know. I think the Winnebago idea is pretty cool, where you can basically, wherever you stop is where you sleep, and you have amenities and everything else. I want to pivot real quick to a sports story that's out. So I'll just read it. Former Soviet chess master is suing Netflix over a line in last year's popular series, The Queen's Gambit. Now, The Queen's Gambit is phenomenal. Searching for Bobby Fischer is one of the greatest chess movies ever, up until Queen's Gambit, because Queen's Gambit is a phenomenal, phenomenal show. Well, there's a line in this where they're talking about Hammond, and they make this quote. They says, Elizabeth Hammond, and this is the announcer. This is when I believe she's in Moscow for one of the chess championships. And the announcer says, Elizabeth Harmon, not all that an important player by their standard. The only unusual thing about her really is her sex. And even that's not unique in Russia. There's Nona Gaprizeveli, but she's the female world champion and has never faced men. My guess is that Lev was expecting an easy win and not the 27-move thrashing that Beth Harmon just gave him. Now, the catch is that person, Nona, is still alive, and that's a real person.
Interesting.
And she's 80 years old at this point. And she makes the point that says, not only is that sexist, but she's suing them for $5 million for the never faced men comment. Now, this is very wild. So one of the things in chess that have never made sense in chess is the bifurcation between men and women playing chess. And so you would have, like, women grandmasters. You would have, like, grandmasters like Susan Polgar, for example, and Susan, and I forget her other sister's name. But Polgar sisters, phenomenally powerful, like strong, super GMs. But they played in regular tournament events. It wasn't like
would they just play together?
No. Like that's what I mean. That's what I said. It doesn't entirely make sense. They used to break up men and women playing chess. So women would play in, like, a women's league, or it would be a WGM, women's grandmaster, or WIM, women's international master. When you think, it's like, why are you doing that? That makes no sense. They're not running a football. Like, they're not, like, hitting people. It's an intellectual pursuit.
It kind of makes sense to me. They split them up. You know why?
Why?
Think about the queen. It's the most powerful thing in chess. They already have a huge lead. Don't give them even more of a lead by letting them play with it. I'm just kidding. It's a stupid joke.
I just always thought it was weird. But that's where this is coming from. Well, like, she's never faced men. Well, one, she said that's not true. So there's that. And she's considering some level of defamation. She says it's extraordinary, grotesquely sexist, and manifestly false. Okay, fair enough.
But I haven't watched it, but you're like, but it's also a great TV show.
It's a great show. It's such a great show. She was phenomenal as a player. But I was bringing this up, though, just because that sounds weird, never face men, but that's what they mean when they're saying that. They used to break up these categories, and it never entirely made sense. I don't think they do it as much today. I haven't seen like the women competition, stuff like that, but they used to have it when I first started playing. They definitely used to have those breakups. And Susan Polgar, one of her main claim to fame was that Judith and Susan was that they were playing in regular events. They were super GMs. And it wasn't a WGM. It was Grandmaster. I just always thought it was weird that they broke that up like that.
But they can't exactly have the sex appeal if it's, I guess they could actually. But if it's only women playing against women, it's harder to have that, like, romantic vibe. Again, unless they're going to make it like a, gay or bi thing. But.
Yeah. But it's... Oh, I see. You're saying the competition itself creating a little bit of energy between the two people. But yeah, I thought this was really interesting, though. But she's saying it's grotesquely sexist and belittling. And she's like, I need $5 million for that line.
Well, I don't know. They made a movie they made a TV show about her. Maybe she's due something. Maybe $5 million sounds a little bit steep. But who knows how much they brought in. This is a Netflix original series, right?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, I've heard it's good. My brother liked it. Blackjack, my brother liked it.
Yeah, it was quite good. I mean, that's so weird though. I mean, I didn't know that all of the people, meaning there's certain people who it's, are real life people, but I don't know, $5 million seems a little steep. But I do get her point though. It's like, hey, you're besmirching my reputation on this. I was a contender. I played all comers, and you're basically saying that I am somehow lesser than what I was. And that's, it's a little weird.
And I literally go to look her up. Beth Harmon.
Yeah.
What's the woman's name? Who is this based on?
Nona. The woman who we're talking about now is called Nona Gaprindavelli. It's Gaprindashvili. I don't know how to pronounce that last name. But Beth Harmon is the one who is the main character of the show.
Okay, fair enough. Let's go into our break. We got Mallory McLaren on the other side. I want to get to her. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. When we come back, we're going to be getting back into an issue we were discussing earlier this week. Remember the transgender MMA fighter who won a big round, sparking conversations that, have lain dormant, some suddenly reinserting themselves over the last couple of years? Well, we're going to be getting into it with Mallory, talking to her about this and athleticism in general as it applies to transgender stuff. We're going to be an interesting conversation. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And like I said, getting into an interesting conversation here. We're joined on the line right now by Mallory McLaren. Mallory, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning? Mallory, we cannot hear you, I'm sad to say. Are you there?
Yeah, I'm definitely here.
There we go. We have you now. Great to have you.
Okay, great. Fantastic. Good morning, guys.
Good morning.
Good morning. So just setting this up for folks. You're a listener to the show. And a while back, a bit over a month ago, Jamarl and I had a conversation kind of offhanded about lab meat. I believe, called in, and you were an expert on it. So we had you on to talk about that. Great conversation when we talked before. Then we were having a conversation earlier this week about this story. Again, the MMA transgender fighter who won a pretty darn effective victory. It wasn't, groundbreaking, but she won handily against her non-trans competitor. This is Alana McLaughlin we're talking about. When we were having that conversation, you sent me a text being like, hey, I have some stuff to say about this. Now, I believe, based on what you said, you are trans yourself, right? This is a little bit of a cagey issue to talk about slightly, but from what you said, you transitioned in your late teens, right, Mallory?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and one of the things I want to preface, my angle at this on is that, I think that it does make quite a bit of difference when someone does, take those steps to affirm their gender, what state of life. For me, it was very early on. And so that shades everything about my experience, not only, being trans identified or someone with an intersex condition, but also my professional development and my life in sports and athleticism.
How long have you participated in sports?
So I was naturally, you can understand that someone who transitions young is probably not automatically in the best position, at least 20 years ago. Around the year 2000, 1999, to be welcomed onto a sports team. They're dealing with other things. They're dealing with how to access hormone therapies, how to access medical care, and how to just get by in the world with a whole bunch of baked-in biases and prejudices against them. But when I entered, I transitioned from 2-year college to 4-year college at the Evergreen State College in Washington State. And one day I was at club day, and the captain of the women's rowing crew pointed at me from a distance and said, "Come here." And she saw me, and I was like, I'm 5'10", 5'11", and so she was like, all right, like I'll go over there and talk to her. And she's like, would you like to row? And I said, well, I've never done it before, but I did have a friend who was a rowing coach back in my home area of Charlotte, and I loved what I saw. And I said, sure, And so I just started rowing then. And I, of course, stuck with rowing after college. And that was where the bulk of my experience in athletics has been, rowing in clubs, and then also ending up rowing, coaching middle and high school rowers in Florida.
So correct me if I'm wrong, you transitioned around the same time you were actually getting involved in rowing. These things were... No. I should have clarified that for you. I began rowing in 2006, so I was in my mid-20s at that point in time. So it was about 6 or 7 years after I had begun, that journey of, my identity as a trans person.
I'll go here. I want to hear this from you. I want to get directly into the issue. A lot of people are concerned about the effect this is going to have on sports, because you have, classically gender-divided sports, the idea being, not just outdated ethical preferences or whatever, however you want to view that, but the idea that men and women in certain grounds are running on different playing fields, specifically when it comes to, levels of physical ability, strength, that kind of thing. And this is a unique threat to that division. And I don't want to use that word too strongly, almost wish I hadn't used it, but this is a unique, I think you see what I'm saying. It's breaking up that division, and a lot of people are like left scratching their heads. How's this going to work? And isn't this, I'll just go directly into it, running the risk of being offensive, please forgive me if I am. A lot of people are looking at this thinking, for women who are having to go against people who were formerly biologically male, men, they're just going to, how are they going to compete?
Well, I don't necessarily disagree with the position that you're discussing here. I think that this analysis has to be taken on a case-by-case basis. And as I recall, you said that this individual who was the MMA fighter was a former Special Forces or Marine or something of that nature. Is that correct?
Yeah, former Special Forces. And you can look at before and after pictures where she was bulked up. She was a big one when she was in Special Forces. And then in the after, she'd significantly trimmed down. But the assumption is that the sort of latent muscle mass or whatever that she developed made it easier after the fact.
Well, I would have qualms with that as well. I don't think that it's necessarily fair for someone who has a history in Special Forces who transitioned at 28 or 30, as I recall, going up against someone who is a natal cis female, and considering that going to be a fair fight just based on the policy of recognize people as they claim to be. This is a much more nuanced issue, and I think that just, for example, I would, if I were an official, I would have had reservations, but I think that my case is different, and I can only speak about this issue from my standpoint, and I don't pretend to be the arbiter, the expert for every single case. For my case, I transitioned many years before I ended up getting into athletics. I was being treated medically for the condition. And I also, well, how do I phrase this? Basically, I didn't make a big issue out of my being trans. By the time that I was in rowing, I was not trying to make an issue out of the fact that I was trans. I was over half a decade into my transition, and hormonally, I was identical to my cis female rowing counterparts. And just to be clear to the audience, when I say cis, I mean everybody who is not identified as trans or non-binary, people who are born in male bodies and identify as men, and people who are born in female bodies and identify as women. I was not in Special Forces. So I also began that. I began my hormones and my treatment before puberty had really even gotten underway. Just for to give you a picture, like when I started hormone therapy, I was 5'10.5" and 140 pounds. Wow, so it's my case was markedly different than this person who is this MMA fighter.
Yeah, the MMA fighter. I think during the time I was shaking my head. I've seen other events like this where the person who was trans, injured badly, female counterpart, meaning the traditional or the born woman in this situation. And so, but I take your point that, you know, it's a case-by-case basis, but therein lies somewhat of the difficulty or the problem or where the conflict is going to be, where you may have some situations where this is fine and this other one is not. And society doesn't typically do well in trying to make those, let's say, dancing between the raindrops in that particular way. I mean, how should they handle this? Should it be a situation where people who are trans function in their own category? And if so, doesn't that create the same problem of disinclusion of that?
Well, that would create a whole other set of problems. Like, that would mean that every single person who wanted to be in athletics who was not cisgender would have to be outing themselves, and that is a very uncomfortable position for people to be in if they want to just actualize and be part of the world without having to deal with stigma just because they want to do a particular thing in life, such as in my case, rowing. So that's a good question, Jamarl. That's a very good question. And I don't have the answer for that. But what I am asking, what I am positing is that we take the time and the effort to engage in the nuance. And that's going to be the best possible and the most just way for us to handle this, instead of having that gut, that quick that bear trap reaction, that trigger reaction of disgust and anger, which is what is naturally happening in this particular instance with this fighter, and also with other athletes. I mean, I think that there was a Canadian mountain biker who also had transitioned, and there has been a backlash against this individual. But I also think that this individual sort of rubbed salt in the wound too, from what I recall. I don't come with specifics. Actually, in my preparation today for our conversation, I was focused more on the transhumanism stuff that Shane wanted to discuss. But yeah,
I brought that up too.
Yeah, and I'm urging us to engage in nuance and not to have a trigger reaction based on one case, because there's so many other folks who are trans in this society who just want to actualize, who just want to do things, whether that be playing chess or playing sports or being doctors or being lawyers, and just don't want to be held back purely on the basis of their biology.
That makes, and I like that approach. That's maybe just more on my end or something, but like nuance. Yes, actually having conversations about these things, which requires nuance, because people have a lot on the line in any side of this. You know, we have a lot invested, whether it's in sports or the very fact of our own identity and how we perceive ourselves. These are, you know, one might say not as equally important as one another, but they're both very important in their own way, in their own spheres. We have a lot riding on this, is my point. So taking the time to like try to understand each other, I think, is a prerequisite for having a productive conversation where everybody leaves the conversation knowing that something useful came out of it, that some more understanding came out of it. Not to toot that horn too much or whatever, but by the perception I have is, sadly, our culture's not having that conversation right now on either side.
No, and neither is the chat room here in YouTube either. I'm taking a look at those comments right now.
Oh, I'm not.
Yeah, the chat rooms are often dicey. I wouldn't necessarily take that stuff to heart. But it is somewhat of a difficult conversation, right? The nuance thing is not something people do well. And I accept your point, and I think you're on some level right? It depends on the situation that people are encountering, and depends on what they're trying to do in that situation and whether or not there are larger consequences for their action. So in the case where a fighter, well, that may be clearly problematic. I guess my issue with this, though, is that in the way Shane said, those conversations don't really take place. And not just not take place, it doesn't take place on either side, meaning the very act of saying, well, wait a minute, that fighter shouldn't be in that contest with the cisgender female because she's going to injure that person. Well, that gets labeled as being transphobic. And it's not transphobic. It's looking at a situation saying, whoa, that looks like a bad idea. By the same token, you can put the rowing issue, and I may have zero issue with that at all, considering the person. I guess the problem, though, is how do you make the fine-grained distinctions as policy? Because I think that's what you're going to end up with.
Sorry for interrupting. There already have been efforts undertaken. My understanding is that, like, at least in the Olympic arena, for someone who's trans to compete, they have to meet certain criteria, such as, I think it's at least 1 year being under medical care, hormone therapy, And there might be other things such as like, taking other affirming steps, such as I don't know what they are, and I don't want to speak as if I know, but I know that there's some sort of minimum period of time where they have to be under the care of an endocrinologist or some such, like I have been, in order for them to be able to be eligible to compete in the qualifying and then ultimately in the Olympics.
Because what we heard in the, we were talking about this the other day, wasn't there a case where it was a team sport, but basically somebody was undergoing transition from female to male while they were playing on the sport, and they were taking huge amounts of testosterone, which in any other circumstance, and I believe should in that one, it's a performance-enhancing drug. Austin's saying it's wrestling. Basically, not a team sport, pardon me. Basically, this person, in the process of undergoing the transition, which I don't have any problems with whatsoever, they had a unique advantage, not just because of inherent muscle mass, which they didn't have at the time, of course, but, moving from female to male, but because they were taking loads and loads of tea. How do you deal with that? Like, you're more in touch with this stuff. That's another part of the conversation, the performance-enhancing drug aspect of it.
I think you'd have to look at reference levels for what a normal testosterone level for males at the age that this individual was competing at would be, and then if this young trans man is wrestling and their reference levels are much higher in their labs, then maybe there is an issue. But again, I think that this is really interesting that you point this out, Shane, because there seems to be far less of people being triggered by female to male individuals who are swimmers and such versus people who are M to F. And I just want to point that out. I don't want to, I just think that that is a little unfair as well. And this is why we need to have the nuance. We need to take the care and the time to actually explore this on a case-by-case basis and to not have, not be so reactionary, particularly because people who are trans are they're already a discrete and insular minority in this country and in our society and on the planet. And they are prejudiced against and discriminated against in so many other ways.
But that's not our agenda on this. Like, we're not trying to be discriminatory. Definitely not. And I know Shane is not.
No, I think the reason that it could come out. I accept the idea that it could come out, but
yeah, the reason that the reason that we're looking at it in those terms, it's not just a bias in and of itself. It's more so dependent upon the sport. It's like you mentioned before, a nuance in regards to situational dependent. And so in a situation where you have a man that transitions into a female fighting other females, well, yeah, I can see, that's not a trigger type thing. That's more of a, okay, that seems unsafe for the other person who's in it. Whereas I don't necessarily see the alternate all that often, meaning I don't see a female transitioning into a man and then getting into the fighting arena in that sense. I think that's why there may be this kind of perspective of bias in regards to the way we're putting a weight on one versus weight on the other. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And I think that there's also the issue of how much of a gender does an individual claim before they end up making that transition or that evolution in life. Like in my case, I never claimed manhood. And that's very evident when people meet me and they talk with me. It's not like I'm not visibly trans, for example. I never took steps to affirm manhood like this individual did who was the fighter. Engaging in the military as a man, going for 12 years of their life in majority from 18 to 30 or so, and then making that choice to transition. I mean, and doing one of the most manly things and masculine things that one can ever imagine, which is to go into the special forces. So, I think that and I certainly I don't impute any kind of negativity on either of your parts. And I just want to clarify that. I was just talking about the bigger picture. I think that we have to engage in bigger picture analysis on this, as well as case by case. But it's just there's a lot of policy implications here for trans people who are already, like I had mentioned before, who are already facing prejudice on so many other fronts, on so many other aspects of life, and they're just trying to get through for the most part. I don't want the case of one individual to be used as the poster for everyone else.
That would be oversimplification. Well, a couple of things here. I wanted to add a comment sort of in response, but then there was also another direction I wanted to go in. And of course, we actually haven't gotten to transhumanism. There's also Evergreen State College, which you mentioned, your alma mater. Also the home of Brett Weinstein, a notorious controversy that anybody who knows Brett Weinstein knows what happened there. But if we have time for it, I want to make sure we get to it. But sticking on this topic for now, you mentioned, people focus, and I'm included in this. People focus more on the F2M than on the M2F. In other words, people focus more on on the M2F than on the F2M. It gets a little bit confusing, these acronyms sometimes. But basically, a man who's transitioning into a woman versus a woman who's transitioning into a man. I think part of that is just the physiology thing. Again, a lot of these.
I would agree with that.
I mean, a lot of these sports are, you require a certain physiological threshold, certain thresholds of strength, how much oxygen your blood can get to your muscles. From the high level stuff that we see to the small level stuff that we don't. But we rely on doctors to explain to us that kind of thing. Men have a lot of unique advantages over women, and I think we can chalk part of it up to that. At the very least, I think that's, the explicit thing. I don't deny that maybe there's implicit stuff too, like men and people in general wanting to protect women. And if there's this perception that a quote unquote former man or whatever, a woman who was born in the body of a man is going into the arena with the strength brought from her manhood as a kid, if she's bringing that into it and she's attacking a woman, then it gets complicated. Do you see what I'm saying? And so I'm not denying, I think the physiology is part of it, but there's also cultural stuff too.
It is far more complicated the longer a person waits in order to transition, because I think that there is a certain air of authenticity that is associated with someone who transitions earlier in life. And so I think that as we move forward in the coming years, we're seeing more and more people who are very young in middle school, elementary school, beginning to explore their identity. And so I think that you're going to see this issue being examined from different aspects, more like what I went through as a young person, where I never claimed manhood. I never identified as a man ever. I was very feminine from the time I was 3, and then by the time I was 17, 18, I was, going to have my name changed, and beginning seeing a doctor. So I think that we should stay tuned about this, but I certainly don't think that we should be casting judgment on an entire population of trans folks based on this one person who is this MMA fighter. And if I had an opportunity to say something to this MMA fighter, I'd probably certainly have some words for them.
Okay, one last question. I want to take us into our break because I do want to get to the other stuff that we're planning on talking about. But one last thing. Another idea, I forget if we brought it up on radio or if it was just in, reserved for the chat that we have after the show's over privately. But this idea of having separate competitive levels, where of course right now you have men versus men, you have women versus women, the idea that you would have trans men versus trans men and trans women versus trans women, that kind of thing. On the one hand, that technically solves one of the problems. It creates separate categories, maybe too clear, and it doesn't take into account the stage of development that the person's undergoing transition. But on the other hand, isn't that just further enshrining and deepening the idea that trans men aren't men and that trans women aren't women? In other words, I don't know that that would work, but that seems like an obvious solution. And failing that, I kind of don't know what else to go to. What's your take, Mallory?
I think that you're completely correct. And then I also imagine that there wouldn't be anybody to compete against if you were a trans athlete, because there are such low numbers of people who are trans or who are non-binary who actually have the courage or take it upon themselves to actually engage in athletics. I mean, I have been an island, and I can't underline that enough. I have been the only person who is not cisgender in all of the environments that I have been in the rowing community. And it's not because the rowing community is biased at all. It's very full of enlightened, very well-educated people, but it's just because it's the numbers game. There just aren't other people who are not cisgender who are in those same spaces. The numbers are very low, so there wouldn't even be enough people to compete in the system like that.
Mallory, I'm going to take us into we don't even have time for it. I'm not going to take us into a break. I'm going to pivot. We got a couple minutes left. I'll probably push it slightly past that. We also wanted to talk about transhumanism. You would, like I mentioned at the introduction, you had first joined us because we were going to be talking about lab-grown meat, which is an inherently kind of frontier-y subject. It's a bit far from what most people are comfortable with. It makes them squeamish, it makes them disgusted, or it makes them excited if they see a promise in it. And, that whole approach, genetic engineering broadly, would be used quite widely in what most people consider transhumanism. I want to talk about this. We've actually had in the distant past Zoltan Istvan, transhumanist candidate for president in America. I want to get him back on at some point, but just can you briefly set us up, re-explaining it? What is transhumanism as you see it, Mallory?
Well, my definition of transhumanism as of today is that there's three facets of it, really. There's two which I focus on. There's increasing longevity. So that would be increasing physiological resilience against diseases or things like aging. That's my main focus. Then there's also super well-being. So just a radical dynamic improvement in well-being. And I will get into that. And then there's also one super intelligence. So I'm not really, that's not really where I focus my thinking on this. But in terms of super well-being, that's more specifically defined in my assessment as phasing out suffering by using technology. So really, those are the three kind of prongs: super longevity and health, super well-being, and super intelligence. And from there, all else flows in the philosophy behind transhumanism.
The transhumanist thing, that's also getting into this notion of augmenting the body in these ways for those particular reasons, correct?
Yeah, I think it's implicit, yes.
Okay, so it's not just using technology for X or Y. It's also incorporating that technology within the person, meaning it's almost like a new human being, or what it means to be a human being is fundamentally different.
And genetic engineering, too.
Yeah.
Like changing the genetic makeup also.
Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, if you think of Logan or Wolverine, it's basically one of the super longevity and super well-being prongs would sort of be associated in some way with like figuring out the disease, how the processes of aging, figuring out the processes, how we can heal ourselves dynamically, and making ourselves ever closer to what we saw or we see represented in Logan's case.
Now, on the one hand, I'll be honest, I'm a pretty open person in a lot of ways. I actually have seen the promise of this for a long time. On the other hand, I absolutely do not trust modern science. And it's not that I don't trust science as a whole. It's just modern science specifically has gotten so politically co-opted. And in general, this is, science, which we treat as an objective and inhuman process, is in fact constantly subjective, and it's subjected to what, any individual scientist's whims are in the moment, and all the unforeseen consequences of large-scale policy planning, population planning. If you start to apply those on the deepest levels to the human body, if you start rewriting the genetic code, if you start doing implants, life extension for me is like, I 100% agree. I'll be honest. That's the one thing where I'm like 100% agree. We should definitely be doing research into making it possible for people to get therapies, cheap therapies, ideally as cheap as possible, to live as long as they want to, as healthfully as possible. That's where I completely agree. But when it comes to like, you mentioned Logan from Wolverine, and I admit it even in the case of life extension, aren't there unpredictable consequences when we work on such deep levels in our genome and implants and all these things? What's your take on that, Mallory?
I certainly would not discount that possibility, but I think that we've also faced that potential in all other areas of science and development in which we have done, not least of which would be pursuing us going out into space in the 50s and 60s. There was a lot of risk associated with that, but we had the courage to do it. I think it's a matter, again, just like we were talking about 10 minutes ago, it's about engaging in the nuance and understanding that risk, but also permitting people their autonomy to make those choices, to participate in those kinds of things. And that's not limited to human test research.
I think I agree, but I think that there's a bit of a difference. I mean, people can take risks, of course, and they can take those risks individually. But it sounds like a lot of this risk is going to be societal wide. And it's not just something where the person is interacting with technology in this way of holding a cell phone or holding a computer or riding in a spaceship. It sounds like there are fundamental changes to the person's genetic or DNA that makes them something else going forward. Now, again, this is kind of one of those things. I used to be a software engineer, and in augmenting even just code, the complications that will be associated with it unforeseen weirdness will take place. And so it's like when you add this to the body, it becomes just, radically complicated. But I don't think I disagree with you, though, that people should have, or maybe have the ability to explore it. I guess the problem comes in, like Gattaca. I don't know if you've seen the movie Gattaca, where
I have.
Right, where it's like they have genetic research that allows the person to just be better. And that could be an intelligence, speed, stamina, healing factor, the works. And you get this kind of bifurcation of society where certain people can afford it, other people can't. And you have basically two tiers. I mean, even in the Star Trek universe, you had the situation where the genetically modified people were outlawed because of the skills and the things associated with the very act of genetically modifying the person. It changed perspective. It changed their capabilities and made it one of those things where some could compete, some couldn't, and with unfair advantages. Are you concerned about those type of outcomes and eventualities? And I guess it depends on how far or the extent of the transhumanism. But are those any issues that concern you when you think about it?
I'm concerned about them, of course, and I'm concerned just based on my own experience as a trans person and seeing how something that I can not fundamentally change about myself has affected my life in negative ways, my advancement and how my treatment. But I think that as I've said before, we have to engage in nuance and not just shut something down just because there is a potentiality of something. That's slippery slope logic that it's very uncreative and it's very lazy to do. And it's something that I reject. And in order for us to move forward, I think that we're going to be forced to engage in a nuanced assessment of these types of technologies. And I just want to say, like, I certainly am not necessarily for having people having to be exposed to things such as genetic engineering to ostensibly improve themselves without their permission. Mm-hmm. So this is not something that I'm talking about, just the same thing that we're going through right now with the COVID vaccines and the mRNA vaccines. We have bodily autonomy, which is sort of, up to this point has, allowed people to not get the vaccines. And I can hardly imagine a situation where we are having, police go door to door to force vaccinations on people. And I think the same thing's going to apply in the decades ahead as we move forward and, and working to make our bodies more biologically resilient.
But still the same, real quick, I want to check with you. Would you be willing to stick with us through the end of the show? We're planning on taking calls the next segment. So, we'd be getting unpredictable questions, all that, but would you be willing to do that, Mallory?
Sure, I can do that.
Awesome. Thank you. But real quick with this, I mean, you brought up the vaccines and the idea of a vaccine mandate and police, not going around forcing people to take shots, not carrying around syringes, injecting it into their arms on the street. I don't see that happening either. But the same concerns that people have about the vax mandate seem to apply ever more strongly to this stuff. The idea that they're going to get locked out of society. The idea that, in the case of vaccines, it's just things like, okay, you can't go out to a restaurant, you can't go out to a movie theater, you can't travel. That starts to get a little bit more serious. But in the case of genetic engineering, in the case of, we haven't even touched on superintelligence yet. If everybody starts wearing a Neuralink, if that becomes your competitive advantage, where you suddenly have access to who knows how many petabytes of RAM of storage in some computer somewhere that you can draw on to remember anything that you've ever seen, to remember any fact that humanity's ever discovered, that kind of thing, if that becomes the status quo, isn't that an immense incentive, practically a necessity for everybody else in the society, even if they have ethical disagreements, even if they think it's horrible? Mallory.
Well, I mean, you could almost say the same thing if somebody had decided to reject having a calculator in school or something. I don't choose to I know it's a bit of a hyperbolic argument, but if you think about it, it's almost similar, like, or having a cell phone. And this almost goes into like the analysis of like the Amish, like they reject these things, but do they make the argument that they are at a disadvantage because they choose? At some point, we have to hold people accountable for the things that they choose for their own lives, and they have to live with the ramifications and the consequences of that.
And you know what? The Amish are actually an interesting case, because if I were to naively be talking about this without any awareness of them, I might think they wouldn't exist. I might think, okay, technology just displaces everybody. I wouldn't assume that actually you can have these pockets of resilient preservation of older technology that seem to be doing pretty well. I was looking at buying an Amish broom the other day because I'd heard how well they were made. And if that's, it's a joke almost, but my point is they do have a place. And so maybe there is another side to this. We're going to be going into a break and coming back, taking your calls, 202-521-1320. Again, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. We're joined by Mallory McLaren. She's an attorney and bioethics professor in South Florida. She's passionate about humanity's duties to the wide range of sentient creatures with whom we share Mother Earth. Another topic we might want to come back on. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. The ghost of Cam lives on. The promo we just played, it's Cameron, former producer for this show. It's just funny. It's a little bit of inside baseball or something like that. But anyway, 202-521-1320 is the phone number. Again, 202-521-1320. Mallory McLaren continues to join us on the phone. She's an attorney and bioethics professor in South Florida, passionate about humanity's duties to the wide range of sentient creatures with whom we share Mother Earth. And in this last segment, for the next 8 or so minutes, we're going to be taking your calls, 202-521-1320, talking about issues relating to transgender folks and transhumanism, a broader and sort of overlapping topic. We have Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, on the line. What's on your mind?
Hey, this is a great conversation. I'm of two minds on it, but you guys went directly into the space that my mind popped to immediately when you guys started talking transhumanism, and that is the case that we're dealing with the vaccines and the mRNA vaccine, right? I guess my ultimate point is that while I am extremely intrigued by the idea of like being able to manipulate ourselves, like the whole Wolverine idea, right? If we're going with that analogy, we can't forget that Wolverine himself, Logan himself, was tortured by the things that was done to him. Mm-hmm. Of course, the mutants and those people that work, those heroes in that world who have been modified and who are changed, are continuously dogged by normal humanity, right? And so, saying that to say this, and I kind of underline all of your points, right? Because it's the same. I'm mostly in agreement with you guys. I have the fear that, especially here in America, especially American culture, but in American society, American society, it would seem that man is not, let's say American society, I'll deal with American society specifically, is not morally or humane enough to begin to take on the transcendence of what it is to be human. I mean, consider that we're talking about, adding different things to the molecular makeup of a person and changing them, and all for these great things. But then the idea of in the wrong hands, or the idea of divisions that come about ultimately, right? I mean, because we're in a place now where statements are made like, well, if you take the vaccine and you get sick, you shouldn't be trying to get medical treatment. You shouldn't be going to the emergency room. You should be going to the doctor. That by the same people who would say who would say they're proponents for Medicare for all and pro-life, right? I mean, pro-choice. You know what I'm saying? So you see how those things, even though these things are on the same plane, we don't connect them because we get so caught up in our little groups and our little crews and our little divisions. So imagine if we reach a point where certain groups can afford to change their bodies so they live forever and they never get sick, while other groups can't afford those things, so they're stuck dealing with like these horrible sicknesses and stuff like that, and to deal with it in at that time would be archaic fashion. And we have examples of that now, whereas you see, if you get sick and you don't have the money or you don't have good insurance, you're done, right? But if you're wealthy and you can afford all these cutting edge treatments, you're straight. So that, to me, that's that scary line, right? That's that scary line. And I just, as much as I would love to be able to implant some stuff and then be able to fly and have superpowers, because I am a super nerd, right? Like to have some Wolverine powers would be cool. But just looking at where we are as a society now and what we do and where we have been, because it's not really changed. We've been cruel to each other for some time now. I don't know that we can handle that. And I'll leave it there for you guys to go further.
Brave. Great call. Great thoughts. Mallory, what do you think?
Well, my thought is this, as you were talking, Brave, and by the way, I've appreciated many of your phone calls in the mornings. I've been a listener. I'm thinking I need to ask us the question, and I'm not, this is just a rhetorical question. How much will we permit ourselves to be held back by our lowest common denominators and our basest instincts in society? Is that who we're going to be? Is that how we're going to let our story as humanity be written? Are we going to let the authors of that be those in our society who represent our basest, most lowest instincts and who are really trying to hold us back? I mean, that's a question that I don't want that to be the case. But I don't want
Mallory, I want to step in for a second. You went somewhere different than I was expecting, and I want to pass it right back to you. I thought you were going to say, who are we, should we be held back by our fear? In other words, should we be held back by our sort of lowest common denominator emotions? But you went towards the people. You're talking about people in positions of power, I'm assuming. What are you talking about there?
I think I'm talking about both in a sense. There's certain actors in our society who don't want us to transcend. There's because of short-term gains and because they are, in my parlance, very low vibration. But then there's also pervasive attitudes that those individuals or some individuals put out, and they sort of poison the well, and they start to change. They try to hold back the zeitgeist, or they try to author the zeitgeist in a way that would lead us away from things that would help us to rise and to transcend. And this is something that makes me very upset. And it's something that I really don't want to be held back by as an individual as I live my life here during the short time that I do have presently to live a life.
And ultimately, I think that's where it comes down personally, because this is, for a lot of people who are into this kind of thing, it's, they can make arguments about wanting to change society and how good this would be for humanity, but it's also just like, I want to try this stuff. And if there's a mandate against investigation into this, if you realize, okay, I'm going to die 60, 70, 80, 90 years old, but theoretically we could do these medical advances that meant that, my mom, my dad, my kids, myself, we could live to, 100, 200, 300 years old easily. If that's where you're coming from, and the idea is a lot of people are like, no, well, we can't do that because of X, Y, Z concerns, X, Y, Z fears. I admit that the fears do dominate the conversation right now. But on the other hand, we're also, it seems, this is what's a little bit worrying to me. We were talking earlier about how people are going to have to compete with each other. And if everybody has a Neuralink, and, if almost everybody does, then isn't everybody soon going to have one, even if they don't want to, just because they have to compete? You brought up the Amish. Another way of looking at this, though, is competition between nations. If the United States holds back on this kind of thing, but China or India, for instance, doesn't, India specifically, interestingly enough, seems like the nation to me most likely to pursue this kind of thing. If you look, I was looking at recent research on their opinions on genome editing, embryonic selection, basically selecting for intelligence among babies. They were looking at this, polling a bunch of different nations, and India was way out, being more accepting. The idea is, if India leads the way and we don't, aren't we going to have to compete on a national level? We've only got a couple seconds left, Mallory, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, it sounds that we're talking about a race to the bottom versus a race to the top, and maybe they're going to be changing the paradigm where we're considering a race to the top, and I think that might actually be not a bad thing.
You're talking, it's almost like idiocracy as the race to the bottom, right?
Yes, or being held back, yes. And if we do stay on this, the path that we have been for the past 20, 30, 40 years, we are going to end up in idiocracy, I fear. And that scares me absolutely to death.
You know what? We've got to close it out. Interesting conversation. Mallory McLaren, thank you for joining us. For those listening, Mallory McLaren, attorney and bioethics professor in South Florida. Great conversation with her. Thanks for joining us. Everybody else, thank you for listening. I want to thank Jamarl Thomas, my co-host. I want to thank producers Austin Pelly and Cordell Woodland. Andre, as always, thanks for engineering today's show. We're going to be signing off. We'll be back on Monday, folks. Hope you all have a great weekend. You've been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. See you on the other side.